Hello and welcome to another Shift Remote. My name's Bilal Harry Khan and I'm going to be your host for this conference. This is the 9th in our 12-part series where we bring together the brightest developers online for you, our incredible audience. I know that some of you are super familiar to the format by now, but a huge welcome to those of you who might be new and joining us for the first time. The way that this conference will work is it's going to be interactive. By that, I mean we're going to try and use the chat where possible. There's also a Q&A, which our team on the back end can try and pick up any questions that you might have for specific speakers for whom we can interact with throughout. We have an incredible lineup of speakers for you today, which I'm sure you're so looking forward to hearing from. And you don't care what I have to say, but what I do have to say is hello. If you can give me a hello back in the chat, give me a thumbs up, give me an emoji, give me something. I love it when you do. And then moving into what this is going to be, we've got about 2.5 hours together. At about the hour and a half mark, we're going to take a 5-minute break, which will be your chance to step away from the screen, grab a coffee, but then be right back here for the second half of what we've got prepared. Now, before we get to that, there are just a few thank yous that I would love to give to our incredible supporters. And those thank yous go to Microsoft, Infobip and Raiffeisen Bank. Also a thank you to Autodesk, Microblink, Barrage, Azure Idea and ICT Japania. Then to the team at Pseudocode and 5, Ars Futura, Nanobit, Infinium and Q. We've also got 9 Dots, Get by Bus, Aspira, Code Anywhere and Plugin Venture. Without you, none of this would be possible, so a huge thank you. As we move into the conference though, I would love it if you can take a photo of yourself, video something wherever you are and use the hashtag ShiftRemote on all the socials. Before we get to that though, I'm going to pass over to our CEO and founder of Shift, Ivan Burazin.
And we're back for today's event of Shift Remote. We had one 2 days ago, but we're here again. Today's topic is user experience or UX. We have an amazing set of speakers, Booking, Google, Adobe, all here. We have so many speakers that it just couldn't fit in the 2.5 hours that I know I said is the limit for a virtual event, but we couldn't just not say no. These speakers are so great. We're happy to have them. And from the amount of people I see signing up, it should be fairly crowded, if we can say that, for a virtual event. In any case, enjoy the show. We only have 3 more. And when that ends, we don't know what will happen after that, but it'll probably be Christmas soon. Anyway, enjoy the show. Tune in for the next one. Subscribe, update, sign into our newsletter, everything to keep up to date with everything that's happening in the Shift world. Thank you so much. Talk to you later.
Thank you, Ivan. Now, who's excited to get ready for the conference? I'm sure that you are, right? You might be waving at your screen, wherever you are in the world. But our first speaker is a senior design advocate at Adobe, as well as a web animation expert and the author of Designing Interface Animation on Rosenfield Media. She's been published numerous times, spoken around the world at absolutely loads of events. Let's welcome Val Head.
Okay, so are we good to start? Okay, thanks so much. This is it's so fun to be joining everyone on the internet in this weird internet-y way. Today, this morning, this afternoon, this evening, whatever time it is for you, I want to talk a bit about designing motion for motion sensitivities, which is something we don't really talk about all that much, but our abilities to address this have changed a lot in recent times, so it's a good time to bring it up. One of the first things that probably comes up for people when talking about this is what do we mean by motion sensitivities? What is what is it? What are we talking about? Like, what is the concern here? And in recent years, we've come to realize as an industry that, like the big picture, that certain types of motion, even we're on certain types of motion on screen, even if they're on a screen as small as, say, a phone, can cause people physical symptoms and things that make them feel dizzy or sick or worse, things like that. And this wasn't really something we really thought about as digital designers until fairly recently. And it was mostly due to some updates to iOS about 5 years ago that made people realize that this was a thing. I think probably one of the best ways to fully understand this, especially if you're not sensitive to motion yourself, is to read some first-person accounts. This is one of my favorites. It's from Eileen Webb, and she does a really great job of kind of explaining her experience and what happens when she encounters some of these super scrolly storytelling, high motion sites, and what happens to her and her migraines. So super useful to kind of get that mindset of what other people are experiencing. Most of the time, these things tend to stem from some sort of vestibular disorder, is why people would have these motion sensitivities. But an important thing to remember is that different people are affected in different ways, have different responses to different stimulus, all that kind of thing. So there's not like one type of motion sensitivity. There's a variety of ways that people might experience this. And today we're going to focus specifically on what we can do with the prefers reduced motion media query to help make things, safer for folks with motion sensitivities. One thing I should mention before I get too far is that animation still absolutely does have the potential to positively impact UX and even accessibility itself. Everything we're talking about today does not negate that. It's really kind of taking it one step further and talking about how we can do this in the most responsible way. If you want to investigate some of the ways animation can help with UX and accessibility, we won't be talking about it today. I did write a book about it a while back. There's lots of articles out there about it too. So that's something to check into if you're not familiar with it. So let's get to the prefers reduced motion query and what this is all about for us as people who make stuff on the web. So the prefers reduced motion is something that people can indicate on the OS level, not just with iOS, also with the Mac OS, with Windows, and some Android operating systems as well, where people can go in and say hey, operating system, I prefer reduced motion. Most of the time, people might do this because they are sensitive to motion on screen, but I've definitely talked to people who just do it because they just want to. There's nothing, it's a user setting, so they can go in and request it for whatever reason they might feel like requesting it. So, and we can also then get information about what people have set there for browser-based content as well. Browser support is pretty darn good. This is a little screenshot from Can I Use, and it's basically all modern browsers and even a few green squares that you might not expect. Things like, Chrome for Android and the Samsung Internet Browser. So the support is pretty widespread and definitely enough that this is something we could consider using in production today. Another note about support is that if somebody shows up to your site where you're using this media query to detect if someone has requested reduced motion and their browser doesn't support it at all, nothing bad will happen. It'll just kind of go on as if that wasn't even there. So using it even when even when the visitor's browser doesn't support it, won't cause any major issues. It just kind of skips it like it wasn't there. So since this is a media query, we can query it the same way we would any other media query. We can do it in CSS, maybe something like this, where we're like, hey, is prefers reduced motion true? If it is, here's some alternate stuff for you to do instead of whatever. And we can do it in JavaScript as well, a little more verbose, but the same idea is there. We're essentially using match media to be like, hey, what has the user set here? Is it true? If it is true, if the user has set reduced motion to true, let's have this alternate behavior, this reduced behavior, and that's how we're going to get it done. So same idea, you're querying this user setting and saying hey, has this person set this to true? If it is, let's do a thing. So there's two responses we can get back from this media query. We can either get back the value of false, which equates to no preference, or the value of true, which equates to reduce. The catch here is that the only one of these values we can be 100% certain somebody went in and selected intentionally is the value of true. So that means that if you get back the value of false or no preference, that could either mean that this person has opted into all levels of motion and they're cool with whatever you want to throw at them figuratively, or it could mean that they just haven't said it yet. So that means we can't really do a super clean progressive enhancement situation where we're like, hey, can you support this? Here it is, because that false value does not guarantee an indication of support or of that preference. So the only one we can rely on for certain is true, which means we're going to be doing things that are more like, hey, is this true? If so, then have reduced behavior. Maybe not as clean and perfect as a progressive enhancement situation, but we can still do a lot with what we've got. So I think the next question that usually comes up once you hear about this ability to query this, you're like, well, where do we use it? Like, what do we apply this to? Good question. Um, the best plan for respecting reduced motion is to first identify what type of motion you might have that could be triggering and might need to be reduced. It often, in these conversations around accessibility and animation, we might assume, like, kind of put all animation in one bucket, and that's not really how this works. Certain types of animation are more likely to be problematic than others. Some are almost guaranteed to be problematic, and some types of animation are pretty much guaranteed to not be a problem at all. So let's dig into that just a bit more. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines recommends providing a reduced version or a reduced mode or whatever you want to call it for any motion that creates the illusion of movement. So you can kind of start to see how they're segmenting or identifying certain types of motion there. Like things that move are going to be, are essentially what they're calling out here. But there's plenty of animation we can do that doesn't make things move. So we're already kind of seeing that line. And this idea of reducing any motion that creates the illusion of motion is painting with a pretty broad brush or casting a really wide net, whatever metaphor you prefer. It's really kind of encompassing a lot of things. And we can get a little bit more specific as far as types of motion or types of effects rather that are highly likely to be a problem for people with motion sensitivities. So I have three main categories I found through talking to folks with motion sensitivities and other types of just kind of casual research that tend to be problematic. So the first is spinning and vortex effects, which, yeah, these are something that when things move in a circle, especially if they move in a circle like infinitely forever and ever, can be problematic and create that illusion of motion to the point of um, making people feel ill. So um, an example of this is a site here where it's a super awesome site. You go to it as it loads up. We kind of see this text move in. And then we also start to see these little like single pixel, I guess, star field, and all the stars are rotating around and around and around. And my video stops. But on the live site, they go forever and ever. And the kind of problematic mismatch here is especially the idea that these are spinning in circles over and over forever, right next to text that is static that you're trying to read. So that mismatch of like motion and static text is the kind of key to what's making this a triggering motion for folks with motion sensitivities. So one thing to note with spinning and vortex effects is that even a small amount of spinning, like even these single pixel stars spinning, can be something that amount of motion or that amount of the illusion of motion can be problematic because of the spinning. One other area that is actually, this is probably the most um, of every single person I've talked to, basically, who is sensitive to motion on screen, has called out this type of motion specifically as being a problem for them. So 100% in the people that I've spoken to. And this is multi-speed or multi-directional movement. So this site, super cool agency site, is the best or has the most multi-directional and multi-speed animation I could find in one site. So if we look at how it works, as you scroll down in this site, things move towards you, some things move up, some things move down, and then they go back down into space again. So lots of multi-directional, up, down, back and forth, lots of multi-speed, lots of that going on here. And this might make you think of parallax, which should be a place your mind is going, because parallax, like literally the definition of parallax effects, is having things move at different speeds. So parallax is multi-speed by its nature, and is definitely 100% something that every single person I've spoken to with motion sensitivities calls out as a problem for them. So if you're using parallax on your site, you probably want to also be thinking about providing a reduced motion variation or path for people to get to that content as well. So parallax, sorry, looks cool, pretty hard on people with motion sensitivities. The last one I wanted to call out, and we kind of saw this in that first example, is constant motion near text. I find this happens a lot in like reading long form articles where you have like a pull quote maybe or a figure that's animated and it's constantly animating right next to text that people are trying to read. And it's a similar problem to what we talked about for the spinning and vortex effect, but spinning isn't a requirement here. Anytime you have animation moving constantly or infinitely near text, that contrast between the moving animation, especially constantly moving animation, and the text that is not moving that you're trying to read can be a mismatch that causes problems for a lot of folks. This is also something I've seen or heard called out by people who maybe aren't sensitive to motion specifically, but have some troubles with like focus and attention. And that kind of like distraction off in the peripheral vision can be a big problem when they're trying to read things. So some of these things that we're doing for reduced motion can benefit other people as well. If you want more examples of the kinds of motion that can be triggering, I wrote this article on a list apart a few years ago, which has a lot of examples of like types of motion that are problematic for folks with motion sensitivity. So lots of examples there. And also this post on the WebKit blog, it's called Responsive Design for Motion, and it also shows a lot of examples of types of effects that could be problematic, and they also go solutions for how these effects can be reduced. So those are both great places to go to find some more examples, because I think it really helps to see examples. If you're not sensitive to motion on screen yourself, it's kind of hard to imagine where what sorts of things might be an issue. So good places to check that out. One thing I want to point out, though, is there are certain types of animation that are not on the list of that the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines call out, or on the list of either of those articles. And that's animation like color changes, opacity fades, and like small changes in scale that don't start becoming an illusion of movement. And I call this out for two reasons. One, to like emphasize that point that certain types of emotion effects are likely to be problematic and others are not. And also, this list, especially when it comes to like color changes and opacity fades, tends to be the things we reach for first when we're doing kind of, let's say, your baseline UI animation. You could go through and make an entire site that all your animation is only opacity fades and color fades. And in that case, you have no motion, so there would be nothing for you to reduce. Chances are you probably have a mix of motion and non-motion animation effects, but we use opacity fades and color changes quite a lot in UI animation. So I think it's important to kind of point out that distinction that it's when we're talking about reduced motion, we're talking about a certain category of motion and types of effects. So how do we respect reduced motion requests? We got this, we're like, hey, these are the types of things we should look out for, things that create the illusion of movement. But like, what do we do specifically with that information? So my advice on how to approach this, to how to respect the reduced motion requests, is to first identify potentially triggering motion. Look on your site, on your product, whatever it might be that you're working on, and identify places like components or user flows, whatever it might be, where you have motion that creates that illusion of movement and might be something that could be problematic, that potentially triggering motion. Um, and then decide the best reduced effect, the best reduced approach based on the context of that animation. And context is really important here because we want to reduce motion to make things safer for folks to use, but we don't want to make it so like the site is broken or unusable or accidentally remove a bunch of content. They still want your content and to use the site. They just want to do it in a way that won't make them sick. So the big distinction there. Most sites if we were looking at kind of like your typical website, my guess is you might have like a handful of motion that might be in that potentially triggering bucket. Going through some commonly used sites, that's usually about what you might see. The exception being, of course, for sites that rely really heavily on motion as part of their design or their messaging, then you might be in a slightly different position. But most of the time, when motion isn't something you're using a ton, you're not like creating an experience or storytelling site, you're just kind of working on a task-based website, if you will, then you probably have a fairly short list. So what do we do with that list? Actually, here's an example of that process in practice. So here is the menu screen for an iOS, well, for iOS. Many of you have seen this. And maybe you've noticed this super zoomy animation that takes you between this menu view into a specific application. So by default, this is what you would get. You click on an app and you just like zoom in. You can, once you know to look for that illusion of motion, like that's a lot of motion going on there. It's covering a lot of ground, a lot of space. It's going really fast. 100% definitely illusion of motion. And actually, specifically, an effect that has been problematic for a lot of folks when iOS introduced this transition. So in iOS, when you go in and you say, hey, iOS, I need reduce motion, please, you will get this effect instead. So instead of that super zoom, they do this where they have a crossfade between that menu screen and the application. So you're still transitioning between the same two things, but they've replaced that high motion effect that could be problematic for folks with a non-motion effect of the crossfade that's safer for people who are sensitive to motion. So that's how iOS approached it. We can also see it in that site I showed you earlier, where this was actually probably the first personal site I saw working with reduced motion, where in this case, if you come to that site we looked at earlier, but you have reduced motion turned on, you see a slightly different experience. The text is already there, it doesn't move in. The star field isn't spinning anymore, but we still have like those hover animations of the navigation, and those kind of like little UX hints that show you like what's active or not, the things that are not really illusions of motion and aren't those vortex effects or that kind of thing. So he's gone in and removed the things that could be potentially triggering, but left those like design details that really make it usable. So good move there. To take a closer look at how this might get done, I have an example for you. So let's say that I have this animation on my site. It's goes like this, where there's a bunch of photos that come in from the top and the bottom, and then there's some text that comes in from the left and right. And it's like definitely multi-directional, right? Left, right, up, down, all the directions basically. And it definitely creates the illusion of motion because, well, you could see that. So this is something I might flag as like, hey, self, I should probably, if I'm going to respect reduced motion, this is an animation I should create a reduced version of. So to give you an idea of how this one works, I did it with CSS, and essentially the starting state of the animation tells the photos to either go down or up, and then sets a transition. So basically it's like, hey, when your properties change in this way. We have a duration and easing and delay set for each of those. So they kind of stagger in and out. Then each of those photos and the end state is basically, and this is totally not legit CSS, but you get the idea, is basically like the end state is like go to where you normally would have been. So go in the line. And that makes the photos go from up here to down there. And I did the same thing with the text of saying like, hey, go out there and then transition into where you would normally be. Obviously, this is done with transforms, so we're getting a lot of that translated position, which is what our motion is driven by. What we can do, and I accidentally skipped that, what we can do for reduced motion is say, hey, we're going to use CSS for this media query since we wrote the animation in CSS, kind of have to match that up. We're like, all right, if reduced motion comes back true, hey, plant photos, instead of starting up here, start where you would have been anyways and have an opacity of 0. Like, all right. And then we do that same thing with the text. We're like, hey, instead of starting out here, just start where you would have been and have an opacity of 0. Friendly text. And then just by changing that beginning state, we can keep the transition the same, the transition details of duration and easing and all of that. We can keep the end state the same. But then when we go to this animation with reduced motion requested or turned on, we get this instead. So we have the photos fade in. They still have their same easing and delays and the same stagger, and the text fades in as well. And we've gone in a pretty straightforward way, essentially replace the movement with an opacity animation, which makes it go from like a motion animation that could be potentially triggering because of the way it was moving to something that's safer for folks with motion sensitivities. We didn't have to change a whole lot. And that's something we could do with JavaScript as well if we had done this animation with JavaScript. So it works fairly well. One thing I would suggest for sites that rely more heavily on motion is to create a custom toggle so reducing motion can be a little more immediate and done in the moment for people. A really great example of this is the Animal Crossing site. It's a site for a video game. Of course, they use lots of motion. When you go there without any preference set, you get a lot of zoomy and spinny motion blur motion. There's even like particles, balloons fly all over the place. Like it's pretty intense motion wise because of the context of it. But there's also right there in the middle a reduce motion button. And if you click that and or go to the site with reduce motion already requested, you see a different version of those of not a different version of the site, but all of those high movement animations are replaced with crossfades and opacity fades. So they've been made safer for folks with motion sensitivities, but the same content and like the same characters and everything are still there. You're not missing anything. They've just removed the part that might be problematic for folks with motion sensitivities. If you want to know how to pull this off, Marcy Sutton has a super awesome code pen that basically shows the logic of how this is done. How you can use reduce motion to automatically give people a reduce motion version, or also have a custom toggle and even remember their settings of what they pick when they go. And turns out like toggles and settings and stuff aren't such a weird thing for websites these days. We see them a lot in places like Twitter, which also has a reduce motion setting within their settings panel. So there's lots of different ways we can solve this problem of where to put the toggle and how to make it make sense for your site and your content. If you want to read more about all of this, I have an article that I wrote, published pretty recently on Smashing Magazine, goes into all of this stuff in way more detail because we kind of just got through the basics today. Hopefully you found that interesting and makes it something you would like to learn more about. And this is a place where you can do it. So if my slides change, thanks so much for listening. And yeah, always happy to talk about this on Twitter or anywhere else if you have questions.
Thank you, Valerie.
Thanks.
That was very, very insightful. I have one trivial remark and one trivial question for you.
Sure.
The remark is, I love the cat on the painting behind you. It's really okay.
Cool.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. That was a great presentation. As I said before, I
Thanks.
do love the cat behind you. Um, and then I have another trivial question: what is with the letter X at the end of the words relative to motion sickness? You're talking about vortex and parallax, and I'm kind of scared with this letter X. And by the way, vortex, I thought of this vertical theme from the Hitchcock movie, and that kind of made me scared. But thank you so much for the great presentation and very insightful slides as well. Quick question, by the way,
Mhm.
everyone, you can ask questions on YouTube in the chat right here below. I'm sure Valerie's happy to answer. We only have about
Mhm.
4 or 5 minutes, so we're gonna go through quick. I have a few questions myself as well. One is
Yeah.
maybe obvious. Is like, wouldn't it be easier to just get rid of the animation altogether, and then you would solve all the problem with reduced animation? Or if yes, why yes or why not?
Not necessarily because, like I said, kind of touched on in the beginning and we didn't get into too much. There are a lot of UX benefits we can have from using motion for things like directing attention, giving feedback, spatial awareness, all those kinds of things. Um, so I think, I mean, you could make the choice if you want to, that like you don't want to use animation because of this, but I don't think that's the right way to go for the reason that animation can have a lot of UX benefits. And also, does not apply to all animation, as I pointed out a couple times. There's certain types of motion effects, highly used motion effects, but there's tons of animation effects we can use that don't cause any problems for motion sensitivities, like those non-motion effects, like opacities and color changes. So using this as a reason to never use animation doesn't really add up.
Uh, that's very good to know. Another thing I also thought when you were presenting, and you mentioned the toggle option, but having a toggle button on the website, for example, for reduced motion, as you might, as you have for different languages, wouldn't this be maybe a solid option for people that would prefer that?
Um, I mean, I think it definitely works and makes a lot of sense for some sites that use a high amount of motion, like things like the Animal Crossing site. I think on a practical level, it might be tough to suggest if if you're like, hey, everyone, I know we don't use a lot of motion, but let's put this toggle in for just the few effects that we have. I feel like that could be a tough thing to get, like your team to buy into. And the thing with reduced motion is since it's set at the OS level, it affects like the OS transitions like we saw for iOS. It also affects like native apps. So it's something that can be set globally for people so they can set it in one place and see the effects. Uh, that's a good pun. See the results of it throughout their experience. They don't have to keep going and setting it in every particular place.
Perfect. And then the last thing, perhaps, where we're still waiting on a question on YouTube. Feel free to ask.
Mhm.
We have a couple of minutes. Um, is there a possibility to have? I'm thinking completely the other way now. I'm thinking privacy, right? Is there a possibility for this to be some kind of potential privacy leak where if anyone knows your preferences, obviously this can be used best case scenario to place products for you, but or any other worst case scenario. Is this something you can work around, or is this
We can these days especially we can never rule out the idea that some information is going to be used in a very like not a way we didn't think of. But because this is something we can opt into, it feels a little less creepy in that sense. Like you have to, as the person using your computer, you opt into it and it's a choice you can make and unmake or change at any time through your settings. So I feel like that's less creepy than like, trying to string together a bunch of data about you to decide what kind of person you are. At least it's a setting you have direct control over and can change at any time. Um, I would love to say there's no way to use that in bad, nefarious ways, but if there's one thing I've learned about computers and stuff and data recently, I feel like maybe there's a way. I can't think of one, but I feel like the fact that it's opt-in and you control that makes it safer than some other other ways our data might get shared.
excellent? Thank you. I think that's a legitimate concern. We do live in interesting times.
Yeah, you have to keep asking those questions because you never know.
Do you, beside the technology reasons, obviously, and frame rate, and is there an estimate that you can say how many or what percentage of people would be have issues with the increased motion levels, and they would actually need the reduced level?
I think it's pretty tough to put a number on it because there's it's a I don't want to say a difficult group to pin down, but there's a lot of factors, right? The fact that, if maybe you're sensitive to motion, well, like myself, I'm sensitive to motion, like like physical motion in like cars and roller coasters. Can't do it. It's
Mhm.
just terrible. Screens
Yeah.
I'm fine with. But there's other people that might be the other way around, right? Where they're like, they have sensitivities to motion, but only certain things trigger them. I've talked to some people in my research who are like fine playing video games. They can play all the first person shooters and like VR games and everything, and they're fine. But then, like a full screen wipe transition when they're trying to edit photos or something is a problem for them. So I think it's tough to narrow down because it's almost like it can vary so much from person to person. And like Eileen talks about in her article, where it's something that might affect her more on some days than others. So I think it's pretty hard to pin down specifically. Though the fact that it is a user setting that you can query, I mean, I guess you could go in and try to get those stats for yourself in some way. But on a global level, it's pretty tough because it's just something that can vary so much from person to person.
Perfect. We are out of time. Thank you, Valerie, Head, for a great presentation. It was an honor to have you here, and we're very, very
Thanks
pleased.
for having me.
We're done for the day, and please follow Valerie on Twitter, and then feel free to you can see her presentation, a link to her presentation on YouTube. And thank you all for attending. Have a good day, all.
Thank you, Val. Now, if you liked what Val had to say, let us know there in the chat. Give us a thought, give us a comment. We love it when you do. But moving into our conference with our next speaker, who is a product designer and community organizer currently based in Amsterdam. In his current role with Booking.com, he works with teams to build systems and tools that empower partners to enable their users to travel and experience the world. He's led design at the Co-Creation Hub, where he's worked across organizations to build products and solve business needs. He's firmly invested in accelerating design education across Africa and has spoken on multiple podcasts. Let's welcome our next speaker, Kene Udeze.
Hi, thanks to the team for having me, and thanks to you for tuning in. So this is my first time delivering a talk remotely over the internet. So bear with me as I work through the kinks. Now, usually I would start this presentation by showing the slide and then see the kind of reaction that I get from the room. But it's safe to assume that everybody is not going to agree with this fairly controversial statement that everyone is a designer. However, I want you to keep that in mind as we walk through the rest of this presentation. So my name is Kene. I am a product designer and community organizer. I like to cook. I like to eat. I like to think that I'm a wanderer. And something that has become consistent or fairly stable beyond my name is the tag that says human, especially when I introduce myself in contexts such as these. Human for me is a reminder that I am building products that are used by other people, but I also hope to use this medium and whenever I introduce myself at conferences to remind my audience that the products that they build are used by other people and used by human beings essentially, but then it also comes with implications and it does have real world consequences. So it's just something I like to add as a reminder. So this talk, or like the premise that led to this talk, or the situation that led to this talk, was from a point of failure, if you may. So this talk is in this talk I'm going to share a story about a failure that occurred fairly recently, and kind of like the highlights or the insights that have come out of that. So now I joined the team as the designer on the team, as the UX designer on the team. And the goal, or what we're trying to achieve, was to ship a product, right? An MVP. So as usual, as the designer in the team, you go through a series of processes that then help you arrive at the final outcome. All of these things are listed, whether it's user research, user testing, the actual interactive prototype design, developer handoff. This is a fairly common things or common activities that designers engage in. So I went through the same thing. I designed a product, ran a couple of user tests, a couple of remote user tests, ran a couple of in-house user tests, compiled the outcomes, implemented the changes, designed the prototype, which helped us carry out those tests with the users. eventually took the learnings from that test into the point whereby we were confident enough to then hand off the designs to the developer. So the developer handoff happened, and then I went off on a vacation. Fast forward a couple of weeks, I'm back from vacation. Of course, the product is ready to launch. However, I quickly noticed that there were differences or discrepancies between the version or the final prototype that shipped, that I had shipped before vacation, and then what went live. Of course, there were interactions or there were conversations around that, whereby the product manager had pointed out the reason or the thinking behind making the cuts. But I had quickly realized that in that process, that part of the reason or part of the reasoning that that those cuts had happened was because in terms of value, the value of certain aspects of the product or certain aspects of the design weren't properly communicated, right? And then I was staring at failure. In as much as the product had launched and we had gone ahead and achieved the goals that we set out to achieve, the bits of the pieces or bits or pieces of the product that then were left on the cutting room floor, if you may, had then left me questioning how much the stakeholders were involved in the process. Because the belief and the feedback from having the interactions after like the milk has spilled, if you may, was that that yes, we understand that we had to make this cut. However, we didn't realize the impact or the thinking behind these design decisions weren't exactly clear. So on my own side, I figured that this was a point of failure on myself, on my design process, and the failure on the design, if you may. Anyway, so I took a step back and then started trying to figure out what I had done wrong or the ways that this process will be improved in the future. A retrospective, if you may. And of course, as a designer, it led me to the question of how might we get stakeholders to actively participate in the design process? Now, if I'm looking at a design team, right? If you're looking at a team, the characteristics or the attributes of a team is that it is this group of people that essentially have common goals. The teams are made up of diverse roles, and usually it is more than one person. There is no I in team. So within the context of a product team or a digital product team, you would find a product manager. You will probably find a team lead. You will find front-end and back-end developers. You will find a designer. You will probably find a dedicated copywriter or copywriter that is going to support that plays a support role. And you find you probably find a product marketer, and you probably find an analyst, or you probably find a manager or a dedicated manager. Essentially, these are a group of people that are going to be working on the team or as a team towards a certain goal. So I have decided to use the football analogy for this because football is a sport I pretty much understand, and I figured that it was very easy for me to fit that into this use football as a way to as a good analogy for this. Anyways, so within the context of the football team, I decided to use, of course, the Croatian national team for this. And in my understanding or the way that I framed this, I would have Ivan as a tester, Sime as an analyst, Dejan Lovren as a product marketing, Luka Modric as a front-end developer, and of course the team lead, Ivan as a copywriter, Mario as the designer. So if you are looking at a football team, there is the defense, right? And the core function of the defense is to prevent the opposing team from scoring goals. If I were to frame that within as a product team, I would say that the core function of the defense in the product team is to prevent noise from getting into the team or prevent tasks that derail the team focus derails the team and the team's focus from achieving the team's key objectives. So the people or the roles that I would consider to be in the defense are the team lead, of course, the product owner or the product manager. You could probably have account managers or analysts. Essentially, these the people in these roles pay attention to protecting the team by preventing noise and filtering the amount of work or filtering the amount of activity or request that gets into the team. So if we're to look at the midfield, so the way that I frame this is that the midfield, for this analogy, is that the midfield are the people who are doing kind of like the unsung heroes, the people who do a lot of heavy lifting, however, don't usually like the end goal or the end goal of the product is not usually their roles are not necessarily the most obvious, right? Because when a user is interacting with a banking application, for instance, they are looking at the pixels moving around. However, it is the backend developers that make sure that the plus and minus of the money that is being sent adds up properly. And of course, you have the testers who test features and the reliability engineers who make sure that those products are available and accessible 100%, or at least they try to maintain 100% like accessibility to those products. Finally, you have the attack, and these are in the context of a football team. Attackers are there to score goals. The main goal of the football match is to score more goals than your opponents. That's the only way you win. So in this framing, the attackers are the designers, the copywriters, and the product managers. Essentially, these are the people who create most of the things that almost like the first line of interaction between the product and the users. So the designers have a great influence into what the users see. The copywriters have a great influence into how the users understand the product. So if we take a look at all the different roles, again, these are all different people working towards a certain goal. So the way I want you to think about this is that designers have a fundamental role to play across the field. So if I were thinking about this again, the question would then be, how do I actively get how might we actively get stakeholders to participate in the design process? Actively being the keywords. So something I want to propose is ways that designers can begin to think and approach the product design process. The first thing I will encourage you to do is to embrace different perspectives. In as much as you have a great control and a great leeway in determining, in as much as you as a designer have great control and great leeway in determining the look and feel of the final product, I will encourage you to invest time in understanding what success means for others, because at the end, the product that you end up building isn't going to be just what it looks like. There are other parts of the business and other parts of the organization that are going to have influence into what the final product looks like. So the first thing I would encourage you to do is to embrace different perspectives. One way to go about this is to invite adjacent roles into your design process. And how you can go about that, if I go back to the failures that I had described at the beginning of this talk, is that one thing that became immediately obvious to me was that in as much as I had shared the outcome of the user testing with the team, they weren't exactly they weren't exactly included in the process. And what that meant was that there was a bit of a gap between the outcomes that they see and the thing and having a clear understanding or even appreciation of the thinking that went, or the processes that helped us arrive at that. So the final goal or the final decisions didn't have the same weight or didn't have the same scientific weight, if you may, to that. In trying to understand other people's perspectives, in trying to understand what success looks like for your product owner, what success looks like for the person in finance, what success looks like for your developers, it's a two-way street. In facilitating and trying to facilitate those conversations, you are also able to open yourself up and then invite other stakeholders into your design process. A manifestation of this could be having developers or product managers or product marketing teams involved in the user testing sessions. Of course, if you're in a team that does not have a dedicated UX researcher, you are probably going to be the person who is going to carry out the UX research yourself. So nothing says that you can't create scripts and other assets that can then help non-researchers have insight and understand the process and why certain things and why the users or why certain feedback happens. Something else I would highly encourage would be to prioritize why over the how. So prioritizing typically when tasks come down the pike, if you may, is that there is of course it's very easy to get into the process of trying to solve the task or trying to solve the problem. However, I will encourage people to take a step back and then understand the why. By understanding the why, you are able to question not just the task but also the premise. And you're not just questioning the premise of the task for questioning's sake. You're questioning because you want to understand how the decision was made to arrive at that point. By asking why, you open yourself to learn. You open yourself to understand again different perspectives. Why success, in as much as success for you might be the speed at which someone completes a sign up. Success for someone else in the sign up in a different side of the org might be slightly different and can possibly run contrary to like your version or your view of success. So asking why again opens you up to have a better understanding of the thinking and the thought process behind some of the things that you do. And finally, it is to actively seek feedback. Something that's again part of the reason that had failed or the case that I had described resulted in failure, if you may, was that I in lots of ways I did, like I said, in as much as I didn't bring the other stakeholders into the process, but there was also that failure to seek feedback as it was happening. You see, oftentimes people find, or some designers can find themselves like working assiduously to design the interface and polish it up. However, what then happens is that by the time you invested, I don't know, 2 weeks, 3 weeks into the process, and it comes, you present a finished product. There possibly is a bit of would I say, not necessarily bias, but when you show a polished product, the person you're showing it to might just be as excited as you to see that vision come to life. However, that excitement then blinds not just you but them as well from asking the right questions about it, because you've just shown them this thing that they've been dreaming about for a while and they just want to go ahead and work on it. If we're able to show our work frequently and show our work often, and then invite, of course, actively seek feedback with people across the product development spectrum, and you can then actively invite people to give feedback on your work and give feedback on the process. Because you're not going to show a polished version of it, it gives you end up presenting the solution that you're working towards in ways that are less intimidating for people in adjacent roles to, to provide input on and to provide feedback. So this change that I'm trying to espouse is already happening in the industry. The way that our design tools are evolving is primarily to encourage more conversations. You can have sketch that you then prototype, do your quick prototypes, and then of course put that on InVision. What then happens is that you invite people to have that conversation. The next evolution of that is a product like Figma, whereby people who are not designers can have the same access to the same tool or to the same view that you do, and then they can leave comments. So essentially, our products or our design tools are already evolving to be able to allow for these conversations to happen. So if you do invest the time to understand what the rest of the org considers success and what other people in the product development role consider success, you are then setting up yourself and your team for a win-win situation, because in the end it's a win for you and the teams that are building, or it's a win for you and for the team that are working together to build this product. But it's also a win for the business because we're able to solve those business goals or meet the business goals in ways that are like optimal. So coming back to this controversial tweet, like I said, we'll come back to it. I would encourage you to take a pause whenever this tweet comes up, because this is a tweet this is a statement actually that you see often, and it's very controversial within the design community. So my question is then, when I see this tweet, my question, or the usual question that I fall back on, is who is a designer? Now, within the context of a product, a designer for me is everyone whose decisions impact what the final product is going to be. So if the backend developer has a feedback that impacts what the product looks like, in that context, that backend developer has helped design the product. The same thing happens for account managers. The same thing happens for or happens with product marketing managers. Everybody whose decision impacts the final view of a product is the designer of that product. A case in point is that one thing to keep in mind is that users are not going to experience your product as a function of the siloed roles that came together to solve or to present that problem or to present that product. Users are going to experience your product as a whole. For instance, if someone is pissed that Twitter, for instance, on Twitter or any of the social media platforms, when there are conversations about how toxic or how negative the platform or a said platform is, it is not a reflection of those conversations are not framed within the context of the recommendation systems or the AI. They are framed as a function of the entire product. So that is something to keep in mind. So it takes a village to raise a child. This is the full version of this African proverb. I am Igbo. I'm from Nigeria and I'm Igbo. And in my own language, it is said that Ofonye anaghị azụ nwa. What that literally means is that it takes more than one person to raise a child. And I believe that products are, in as much as it takes one person to raise a child, it takes the products, the humans are like the sum of the experiences of its community. The same way the humans are some of the experiences of its community, products are the sum of experiences of the people who build it. I would encourage you to reach out to people in our adjacent roles as you think about building the products, and as you think about improving the products, and as you think about creating products for other people. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. It really does take a village, right? That is something that my mum used to tell me a lot growing up. Now, our next speaker is a senior software engineer specializing in the development of HTTP proxy servers that optimize web performance. He's mainly interested in web technologies and ways to make them faster. And we're speaking in this about JS delivery without the trade-offs. This talk will discuss the Web Bundles proposal, its benefits over the status quo, and what path it will still need to go through until you'd be able to use it. I'm sure there'll be loads to learn. Take some notes for this one. Let's welcome Yoav Weiss.
Hi, I'm Yoav Weiss. I work at Google as part of the Chrome team, and I wanted to talk to you all today about a platform feature that I'm working on, which I believe can make the delivery of your large JavaScript apps significantly faster. But first, let me start with a caveat. This is not a here's a tool you can use today in your work kind of talk. This is more of a here's what the future may look like if I have my way kind of talk. But I believe that future will be bright, so I hope you bear with me. So in this talk, I will outline why JavaScript loading on the web today is not great. What are all the aspects in which it can be better, and how I'm planning to tackle all those different issues with new and exciting web platform capabilities. So yeah, let's go. So what's wrong with JavaScript loading today? First, we have a lot of it. Many websites and web apps today have a lot of JavaScript. The functionality those sites require is becoming more and more complex, and the code that's required to support it grows accordingly. I could tell y'all to ship less JavaScript, and if you can, you totally should, because it will make your websites faster. But that's not necessarily a good long-term solution. On top of that, we're delivering all that JavaScript in small chunks. So because humans like to work with small chunks of code at a time, that makes it easier to understand that code and to divide labor on. Working with small chunks of code also makes it easier to reuse bits of pieces from that code in various projects, whether those are homegrown code or open source libraries. But combining the fact that we load a lot of JavaScript and we do that in small chunks really adds up. And we knew that and understood that ever since the early days of the web. We knew that requests have a cost. With HTTP 1.1, the browser was limited in the number of connections it was allowed to open to each server. And that resulted in those kind of waterfalls where the browser can only send so many requests at a time. And it took many round trips to bring all those resources down for pages that loaded a lot of resources. We had high hopes that HTTP2, or H2 for short, would fix that, but reality proved to be more complex than that. H2 was supposed to fix things, and it did to some extent. It fixed the cost on the network and made it so that we can send all the requests simultaneously or almost simultaneously, and then that makes the loading process bandwidth constrained and not latency constrained. But that doesn't mean requests are now free. Each resource is still compressed individually. So even with H2, if you don't bundle your code, the compression rates you see are significantly smaller. Why is that? Compression algorithms rely heavily on backward references, essentially telling the browser, remember that long string you've seen before? Here's another one that's exactly the same. But so if we're dealing with longer files, they have a longer frame of reference and can indicate strings that were seen much earlier that are potentially a good fit. But when files are really small, the frame of reference is really small and compression doesn't do a whole lot. We tried to tackle that in the past with a proposal that would enable compression to work across H2 streams, so across different resources. But that proposal never took off, mostly because compression can be risky when applied in shared contexts between unrelated files, and there were security concerns that cross-stream compression would help to reveal secrets from some resources when an attacker has control over other resources. So that plan didn't work out. On top of that, internal processing in the browser means that every extra request also adds a cost. The requests are created in the render process, which then sends them to the browser process, which checks the network process. Potentially, it may check the HTTP cache, which adds disk access costs. Service workers can get also add some more IPC or inter-process communication costs to that equation. And when we have hundreds or even thousands of tiny modules or tiny files that our page is putting together, that can result in a substantial slowdown in the order of 1 millisecond per request for Chrome. It can be slightly smaller than that, but that's the general order of magnitude. So as a result, people bundle their code using Webpack, Rollup, and others. And these bundlers perform various optimizations on your content. They perform code splitting, which means that instead of creating one huge bundle that includes your entire website, they create bundles that correspond to each one of your entry points or routes, and which are somehow smaller and more easier to manage. They perform hashing, so make sure that your static content has content-based hashes as part of the URL, which enable long-term caching. And they do all kinds of transformations, so image compression, text compression, dead code elimination, transpilation. Bundlers also have multiple types of output formats today, but all of those different output formats all come down to essentially a big ball of JavaScript, a single JavaScript file, which results in the loss of any caching ability of the individual resources inside it. Why is losing caching bad? Well, first of all, files change over time. If small parts of your JavaScript in the bundle change, so one or two individual resources changed, that means you have to invalidate the entire bundle and send all that code anew to the browser that will then have to parse and execute it. And other than that, modules also can be shared across different entry points, and so theoretically could be shared across different bundles, but there is no easy way to do that. If you have shared modules, you probably have to either include them in different bundles or spin them off to a separate shared bundle, and then include that shared bundle from all the different entry points. But what is shared can vary significantly between the different entry points. And if you have many entry points, the shared module paradigm can get real tricky real fast. So essentially, we have a granularity problem on our hands. There is an inherent trade-off between bundling, which is great for delivery, and caching, which is great to not have to deliver anything at all in cases that we don't have to. Folks who bundle their scripts or the bundlers themselves have to think long and hard about which modules or chunks to include in each bundle to minimize the risk of cache invalidation that will drag the entire bundle with it. And even if we bundle, we need to keep an eye on granularity to ensure the trade-off is respected and we don't hurt delivery in favor of caching and vice versa. Another issue with the big ball of JavaScript approach is that execution cannot start before we have downloaded and parsed the entire file. When the network is constrained, that can add significant delay to the time we could run the beginning of the beginning chunk of the file if we had streamed execution. But JavaScript file can only start execution once the entire file was fully downloaded and parsed. So while V8 has stream parsing, and theoretically, we can also enable stream compilation of JavaScript. The format doesn't allow us to perform streamed execution. That's not awful when your files are small, but starts to get substantially slower when sending down huge, like multiple hundreds of kilobytes huge bundles to the browser. And what that means is that the browser is forced to execute that bundle on the main thread only once it arrives in its entirety, which can result in long execution tasks, initializing everything the bundle initializes. So let's take this module structure as an example. Above, you can see the dependency tree, and below, you can see the order in which they execute. So the order in which we bundle them into a JavaScript blob. Today in V8, we have stream parsing. So the full cycle of download, parse, compile, and execute with parsing happens more or less in parallel to the download. But then compilation and execution are sequential after that. And for browsers that don't have stream parsing, that can be even worse, and parsing as well can be sequential to the download process. Theoretically, we could improve things further with the big ball of JavaScript approach by enabling inner function parallel compilation as part of the JavaScript engine. And that would enable compilation to also happen largely in parallel to the parsing process. So that would shorten our times, but still execution can only start after compilation is completely done. There's no way for us to stream execution. But if we had file by file granularity of the internal resources in the bundle, that would enable an engine, even without the fancy stream compilation, to make things significantly faster and have, in a way, streamed execution, because execution of each file can start once its compilation is done. Resource in the bunch. So that would also hugely benefit engines that don't have parallel parsing and parallel compilation optimizations, as it would reduce their importance. Okay, so as the title of the talk suggests, I think that this magical format exists in the form of the web bundles proposal. What's web bundles? It's a new format that enables you to wrap a bunch of HTTP requests and responses into a single file. If you're familiar with MHTML, it's somewhat similar, but without the ickiness of multipart. So while web bundles can be used for all kinds of resources, I'm particularly interested in their use in the context of JavaScript resources, as you may have guessed. Why are they so great? Because having a single resource that contains separate, individually addressable sub-resources helps us solve the granularity problem and eliminate the trade-off we just talked about. When it comes to compression, a web bundle is a single file and can be compressed as such. That means that it enables the compression engine to have backward references from one resource to the previous one, and achieve similar compression ratios to the one we would get if we were to concatenate all of them and then compress, which is what Webpack and others do today. Those security questions that were raised around cross-stream H2 compression don't really apply here, because in the web bundles case, compression happens on a static file as part of the build process, which doesn't include any per user data, so doesn't include any user sensitive data. So it cannot be exploited as a result to extract that data. So web bundles give us the same compression improvements compared to the unbundled approach that we see from Webpack and other bundlers today. But when it comes to caching, we will see a major improvement. The difference is in the big ball of JavaScript approach, we're losing the individual files. In the web bundle approach, each file, each resource inside the bundle gets to maintain their own URL and their own caching headers. So resources inside the bundle can have lower lifetimes than the bundle itself. And content referencing those resources can modify itself to not reference one of them that is no longer valid, while referencing all the rest of them that are already in the cache. The general use pattern that we have in mind is this. So we will have a link rel web bundle declaration that will tell the browser that a bundle is available for the sub resources, but then the rest of the content will just address those resources as they are with their regular URL, which raises a couple of questions. One, how can we avoid double downloading those resources? How can the browser know that resources in the bundle are indeed in the bundle before it downloaded the bundle? And the second question, how can we communicate cache state to the server? So assuming that the browser knows that some resources in the bundle are not really needed to be downloaded from the server because they're already in cache, how can the browser communicate that to the server so that the server knows that and avoids sending those resources down? That second question, as an aside, is slightly similar to a problem we had with H2 push, where many folks were using it and pushing resources already in the cache, wasting bandwidth and users' time in the process. This is something we try to address with something called cache digests. Basically, sending a digest from the browser to the server, which is a probabilistic data set that represents all the URLs that are in the cache for this particular origin. It's using some math magic to represent those URLs in a condensed way that I don't really have time to dig into right now. But it was a really neat proposal that eventually didn't work out because H2 push implementers were not excited about implementing it because they were seeing overall negative results from H2 push and weren't willing to invest in it more. But okay, one way to solve those two problems is using the scope attribute, which will enable the browser to know what scope the bundle covers and then match any outgoing request with that scope and see that it's supposed to be in the bundle and not fetch those resources, not double fetch them. Also, we could have theoretically scope-based cache digests reusing that H2 push proposal that will be able to notify the server side what is in the browser cache for that particular scope. So in this scenario, the browser would keep track of all its cached resources that are included in a certain scope and send a digest that covers those resources to the server alongside the bundle request as a header. This proposal seems to have a decent developer experience because the HTML is not too cluttered. It just includes the scope attribute, which is fairly limited. But it's also likely to have significant implementation costs because browser caches, as they are implemented today, are not arranged in a way that enables them to generate digests based on arbitrary scopes. And it will require a bunch of work to enable that. Another proposed alternative is a resources list under the resources attribute, which outlines all the resources that the bundle contains. This would be significantly more efficient from the request perspective and from the browser's perspective, as the browser would only need to send a bitmap indicating which of those resources is already in the cache, which would result in smaller requests. It would also be easier to implement because it matches the way that current cache implementations query the cache. But at the same time, the developer experience may not be so great. Those lists will clutter the HTML and will probably require the HTML to be part of the build tool chain, which can add complexity. So what I have in mind in terms of the bundle generation itself is that it's generated at build time in a similar way to how bundles are generated today by Webpack and Rollup, only outputting a web bundle instead of a JavaScript blob. And then a dynamic server component would be able to take that bundle, take the request that the browser sent for that bundle, including a suggest or a we use the resources or the scope attributes, and then exclude any resources that the browser already has in its cache from that bundle, essentially subsetting the bundle. Note that the server in this case can be stateless and doesn't really need any information other than the bundle itself and the request with its digest or bitmap in order to do that process. When it comes to compression, one glitch in the plan is that static files can get more efficient Broccoli compression levels during build time by using Broccoli 11 that takes more CPU, but produces files that are 10 to 15% smaller. So that creates another trade-off here between subsetting the bundles and setting the highly compressed originals. But I was fortunate to host an intern this summer that took a crack at this problem and managed to reuse information the compressor generated by compressing a bundle with Broccoli 11 when compressing a subsetted version of that same bundle. So in other words, we can reuse the compression information from the entire bundle to compress a subsetted one, the one that doesn't contain a few chunks or a few modules that are already cached. And that result, like we got exciting results on that, up to 5.3 smaller files for the subset recompression with compression that is faster than the regular on-the-fly Broccoli 5 compression. That means that we can get both on-the-fly compression and high-quality one when operating on subsetted bundles. And finally, when it comes to execution, with web bundles, we get the file-by-file granularity we talked about, and we can get almost streaming execution without any fancy JavaScript optimizations, just because we're dealing with smaller files. So does all this require ES6 modules, ES modules? Not really. The scheme can be useful for any content that is composed of multiple small resources. So even as a replacement for image sprites, if you're still using them. But in particular, it can be useful to deliver classical script. Doesn't really require ES modules at all. And more than that, it can be faster today using classical script because module script don't really support streamed execution because they need the entire model tree to be downloaded before they start execution. At the same time, web bundles, in my opinion at least, are critical and required to enable fast ES modules in the future. So if we want to make ES modules loading fast and as fast as classical script, we need web bundles, as well as some changes to the way ES modules run. In particular, we need eager execution before the full module tree is downloaded, ability to run tasks between modules. And one thing I left out here, the browser needs to be aware of the full dependency tree for ES modules before execution starts. So we need an out-of-band way to communicate that module tree. So to sum it up, JavaScript loading is suboptimal today. Bundlers are doing what they can, but the platform needs to support them better. Web bundles can make things substantially better. They can improve caching, resource sharing between bundles, and execution speeds without compromising on compression quality. And finally, fast ES modules delivery will require more work. Web bundles are a required step for that, but won't get us all the way there on their own. And we need to do more work to optimize the way ES modules are loaded and run in order to make them really fast. And with that, thank you. And I don't know.
Thank you, Yoav. And we have one more speaker before our break, and we're looking at building the right product. Neven Vuga is a senior product designer at Five, who are located in Zagreb, Croatia, and they're focused on enabling business across the world to build better products, no matter the size, from startups through to large-scale enterprises. Let's welcome Neven Vuga.
Hi everyone, my name is Neven. I'm a product designer and the design team lead at Five. And today I'd like to talk to you about product discovery and let you in on some of our secrets, some of our tips and tricks, how we use product discovery to make sure we are building the right product. So here we have a typical product discovery broken down into phases you probably recognize. Those are research, alignment, ideation, validation, and definition. Average duration of our product discovery is 8 weeks, but depending on the number of experiments or features we need to validate, it can vary between 3 weeks and 3 months. You could probably compare this process to design sprints, but my issue with design sprint is it only validates 1 or 2 ideas, and that is usually not enough for an MVP. So this is why we are doing this longer discovery. Okay, so our small team includes the following experts. We got a product manager. We got at least 2 product designers, given the scope and the pace of the project, and at least 1 solution architect. Speaking of which, here is a great example where a solutions architect made a huge difference on the project. So we had quite a few tech constraints coming in into the project, and there were different solutions to the same problem. So decision framework helped us make the right choice early into the project. Okay, let's talk about research and alignment. So usually we use these for tactics, but of course there are more you can use. So user interviews, stakeholder interviews, product purpose workshops, and goal setting workshops. Now, if you're limited on time and or resource, and you could do just one, I would suggest you choose the following 2, because one will not be enough. So user interviews and product purpose workshop. First of all, you need to talk to your users. You'd be surprised what you'll find out. For example, the product idea might completely change. One of our recent projects started off as a mobile app, but it turned out to be better suited as a web app for our target audience. Next, you got to define the product purpose. That's the product purpose workshop. Defining the product purpose will help you keep the eyes on the ball later in the project. So in this example, we partnered with Princeton University Press to launch a bird watching app. And defining the product purpose, which was helping people identify a bird they see in the wild, helped us a lot to keep focused later on. That included the following three things. First of all, we knew what we must test with users. We knew how to prioritize content and what are the must-have features for the MVP. Okay, next are ideation and validation. This is where the big ideas will be put to a test. Our usual methods include ideation workshops, prototyping, and validation. So ideation workshops are usually done in person, but now we manage to do those remote. You can either go old school, pen and paper style, or you can utilize collaboration tools such as Mural or Miro. Again, if you could do one, please do the following two: prototyping and validation. These two come hand in hand. So static UI design just don't cut it anymore. Nowadays, you need to prototype your UI to show the full interaction. With that, you need to validate your assumptions with users. And what better way to do that than to put something tangible in front of them? Okay, now it's time to decide what gets built first. We usually do the impact mapping, impact uncertainty matrix, and feature prioritization. Now, again, if you're limited on time and resource and you could do just one, I would suggest feature prioritization. But you must draw a firm line what goes into the MVP and what will be left out for later iterations of the product. If that fails, you can always turn to quote unquote spending coins workshop. Giving stakeholders allowance helps them make hard decisions. So they got a limited number of coins they can use on a particular feature, and that helps deciding what goes in the MVP. Here's an example of organization where we started off with a 6-week discovery that got us to a complete roadmap of the product. We are now building with the client. So we managed to define the full roadmap during the discovery phase, and now we are integrated as an agile product design and development team with the client. Okay, you might think all that sounds great, but what after product discovery is done? Well, in our experience, what started off as a product discovery project turned out to be a long-term partnership. So during the almost 1-year engagement, we managed to keep a similar product discovery process for each new feature, but just in a shorter time frame. So the process goes like this. We still have user interviews for the new feature ideas. We turn those findings into user needs. We design the prototypes, validate them with users, apply all the learnings from the validation with users, and deliver the final designs to the engineering team. These cycles now usually take around 2 weeks. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with these 5 takeaways. First of all, there's always time for discovery. you can do it in less than 3 weeks. Then identify the highest risk assumptions to focus on. Find a quick and dirty research method to validate those assumptions. Take time to talk to your users before building. You'd be surprised by hidden opportunities you might uncover. And finally, remember you can always add more features after the launch of the initial product. Thank you.
Thank you, Naven, for that. And with that, that takes us to our break. We have 5 minutes to grab yourselves a drink, get yourselves refreshed, and then be back in front of the screens. If you've liked something so far that you've heard, let us know on the hashtag #ShiftRemote for this event, or always come to the chat, ask us a question, tell us what's going on for you in your world. But we'll see you again soon in 5 minutes' time. Hello and welcome back after the break. If you can hear my voice, that does mean that we're about to get on with the second half of our conference today. If you can't hear my voice, well, you wouldn't know, but you're definitely missing out. Next up, we're talking at the lessons learned from running a design system, or how to escape a filter bubble. Our next speaker is a product lead at Trivago, and before he transitioned into that role, he was introducing the design system engineering team at Trivago and has led the creation and rollout of a pattern library. He's also the proud owner of 2 unicorns. Let's introduce Christoph Reinhardt. Hello and welcome back.
Thanks for tuning in into my session and talk about lessons learned from running a design system. Something we have been, a project that we have driven at Trivago for a couple of years now. And I would like to share a bit, first of all, how we got there, what we actually built, and at the end also what we learned from running and creating our own design system. Before I do that, I will just give a bit of history and actually telling a bit about the story of myself joining Trivago and where actually the whole story began. It was 2012 when I actually left the agency I was working in Germany and joined Trivago as a dedicated front-end developer. I have just been told that at that time the former or the current team had already redesigned the whole application, and I was very excited to join Trivago as a larger company and have the opportunity to work on that project or product which a lot of customers are actually using. So I started, I was quite excited, and as my duty as a front-end developer, I said, okay, that will probably be fun, and that's also what everyone else told me. You will have a lot of opportunities and it will be super exciting, and we just have rewritten our application and you will be see state of the art in front-end development. So I was quite curious, and what I did on my first or second day, I tried to do a first directory listing because I thought, okay, probably a first look on how they have set up their CSS structure, because it's normally, especially at in the beginning of the decade, it's always a bit difficult to make CSS really scalable. And I was quite confused when I looked into this folder and found out that the CSS files actually even weren't CSS files, but they were actually ink files. So I thought, okay, probably there must be a reason for it. And I actually then started to look, okay, what is actually the content, and try to make some code analysis on those CSS files. And I was actually quite impressed, but also worried to see the specificity which actually was in the CSS files. So just for context, the more complex your selectors are, the higher the specificity of your CSS will be. And I was actually a bit surprised that it's possible to draw kind of a skyline just with a CSS specificity. And then I thought, okay, probably the CSS was not the part that they focused on while rewriting the application. So let's look on a view source. And the outlook I was actually so just an example here where you have actually an on-click element on all DOM nodes, which actually called the PHP file on the server side. So I felt a bit like, oh my God, what have I done? But again, every challenge and every challenge also comes with an opportunity to make it better. And here were a lot of opportunities to improve things. So I remember that I joined in 2013 the Beyond Tellerrand conference, which is hosted here in Germany in 3 different locations. And I was the first time that I actually got exposed to the concept of atomic design from Brett Frost, and how to build more sustainable, scalable UIs, utilizing style guides, utilizing approaches like atomic design to just come to a more consistent and better UI or user interface architecture. So I thought that's something I should adapt. So that's something definitely what I have seen from my first weeks at Trivago. I should look also to apply something like that to Trivago. And the first thing that I did, we have a kind of internal network where we share ideas, where we share certain things that we have learned. And so I said, okay, what about the introduction of a style guide for our core application, which is called Price Search. As you can see here, it was actually a message that I sent out in 2013, and the response at that time was very good. So I said, okay, there's probably an interest to get something like that running. And on a side project, next to my usual work, I started with creating the first kind of style guide, just to help people, for example, to use the right colors, to expose button elements and make it easier for people to reuse stuff, which at the end should help to create a better and more sustainable front-end architecture. I was actually quite lucky because that was already then approaching 2014. And because we didn't have a style guide or any kind of design system in place, our application became quite inconsistent. And for example, this one is what I call the 50 Shades of Grays. It was just an extract of all the different gray colors we used on our product and actually already on our first view. And of course, something like that happens if you don't have a proper style guide and if you don't give people the right tools to make things consistent. That did not only happen to gray, that also happened to green, which is our call to action color. And of course, the more green you have in your product doesn't necessarily mean that you have a better conversion. Probably it's even the opposite. It also happened to orange or actually blue and actually all main colors we used in our product. And I think this was also kind of my advantage because at that point, the application and the consistency of the application got so messy that it was, after showing this also to everyone in the company, that we had to kick off a proper design system. Because it was actually colors Trivago, and at Hotels Trivago, we are very good with using all possible shades of colors that were available out there. But it was not only the colors which were a bit messy, and I remember that kind of image sprite which we had in 2014, which was also not maintainable anymore. It was somewhere saved on a designer's local machine, and if you wanted to update it, it got very tricky, and we had to do several rollbacks because after updating the sprite, icons were missing. And of course, if you don't have any kind of better approaches to write your front-end code, you probably also end up like having your CSS file looking like this. So that's actually not something I made up. That's actually just an excerpt of one of our old files where you can see there are actually a lot of valid questions on that file, which actually shows that this was not sustainable at that point anymore and really slowed us down in development. Also, probably also not nice that we have different products, and for example, some of them just used a basic bootstrap, which I also found at that time not state of the art anymore. And so we decided to come up with a proof of concept because just rebuilding or applying or putting a design system on a product like Trivago is not that easy because it's actually a moving target and there are a lot of people working on it. So we said, okay, we need to kind of create first our system offline. And at that point, we started to hire an external freelancer, which helped us to set up the first called master file, which at that time was an Illustrator. The only downside with that file was that it was around 500 megabyte, and it was actually not, was not feasible to open it on a laptop without your fans crashing. But at least it was the first time that we really broke down our UI into a more systematic approach, and we looked, okay, what are actually our colors that we want to use? What are the fonts? How do our grids like? I think this was the kind of birth for our design system. We started to apply the atomic design approach from Red Force to really also create a kind of common language that designers, engineers, but as well product managers understood, and we built up our first system with that. And our idea was then, okay, it's all good to have that in a static file, to have design assets, but at the end, our idea was to to create a system that is also easy for developers to pick up, but they easily can integrate front-end components into the system. So we said, okay, when we really want to start small, and looked on what are actually the main patterns and the main components we actually need, and we came up with a small set of components that we put into our first library. At that time, we were also quite rather small team, so we decided to not build our own UI, but adapted the pattern lab from where it first and started to build our atoms, started to build our molecules and our organisms and templates. And then started to pick one application, which is here what I have shown former, which was this Bootstrap application, and started to apply this new system onto that application, which was also, of course, a quite not that complex application, but it really helped us to understand, okay, what is working and how fast can we actually deliver UI relaunches that we don't always have to reinvent the wheel. That actually worked quite well. So we scaled that up to more projects that we were running at that time. And you can already see that you already see here kind of consistency in how these applications then were looking. But this was already the point where we then started to think about, okay, actually we wanted to create a minimum viable design system, but then we at that point already introduced a bit of scope creep because we were building whole pages and whole applications into our pattern lab, which was then actually ending up into scope creep, which we at that point even didn't realize because the applications we focused on were also rather simplistic. But this was something which we struggled on then later with a lot. But at that point, we were not aware of that. So we said, okay, everything is working super well. So we want to scale that now up and put that onto our core product, the Trivago Hotel Search. And for that, you need to know that this is an application that at that point in time already, I think around 200 or 150 people were working on it. So we had to educate all people, and we had the buy-in from the leadership to go that way. And so quite confident, we went into, this is just something that my colleague Andy Grunwald at that point posted, you can see it's from 2015, where we started to introduce it to all our product people, so to the whole product department. And at that point, the product department was already into the core product and had a refactoring of around 4 weeks where we put that in. So after we have done that and had made the technical foundation stable, we said, okay, now we show everyone in the company the benefits of having such a design system. So what you can see here is our former what we call a search result element, which we then redesigned with the new patterns we actually have made. And then we redesigned that, put that onto, I have some background noise here. Sorry for that, I have some background noise here. Then we put that onto the new item element and redesigned that. And this was actually something which actually then also showed all the benefits from running this design system, because we were quite fast on shipping that. So what we do at Trivago and is A/B testing. So we always make sure that every test we do actually is tested in actually have two versions of our application. One where we put out the new feature or the new redesign, relaunch, and compare it to the old version. And then we have different metrics that we as Trivago as a company look like. Some of them are conversion metrics, some of them are click metrics. So just for internal reasons, I will not expose what these metrics are, but what is important to see here is that we actually started after rebuilding this application on the design system, that we actually started quite negative, which you can see here, a performance of minus 8.7% and minus 5.2%. And you can see this is the amount of days it is actually running. And then you can see that we did a lot of smaller iterations on improving, fixing bugs, making sure that we can iterate fast on that. And then you can see after 3 days, 5 days, 6 days, 7 days, we massively, super fast improved the performance of that. And we were able to rebuild the core components of our hotel search application with the design system. I now fast forward on 12 months later down the line. We actually have put this design system on around 15 different applications, which I just tried to highlight here in a screenshot. There are projects or products like our Trivago tech blog, our company pages, things that we need for communicating with our advertiser, marketing landing pages. And at that point, I think it was we were really riding the wave, and we were quite probably a bit too overconfident that this will scale for a longer time. We also put a lot of effort into documenting. So we adapted the pattern lab. We integrated TwigDoc to have a better communication to everyone, to have documentation. We integrated accessibility testing, and so basically pimping this pattern lab even more and more and more to make it more accessible and more understandable for everyone. We also, at that point, already had a multi-package repo running on Learner, which we used to really have several smaller packages, which makes it just easier for people to integrate components into any of those applications. I think this was then also the time when we really started to realize what kind of complex monster we actually have built. So we then started to find out, okay, if you want to serve 15 applications, your documentation needs to be super bulletproof. So we had lacks in documentation, which we struggled with, because then you always have different requests. You have to explain it to different stakeholders, teams again, and then you actually always come in a loop of explaining some things, and you don't have time to finish your documentation, and you're kind of ending a kind of vicious circle of workload. Also something that we realized that every of these applications ran differently. So we had different release processes of all those applications and also different integration methods. We also had to put a lot of focus on linting and quality, because if you create a kind of system, a team might be using your application or your design system that you even never have talked to. And so you need to make sure that everything is really on high quality, that there are no quality issues in the patterns you actually publish or release. Maintenance, which is basically all of that, is something that requires a lot of work. There's delivery and integration, continuous delivery, and also making sure it can be continuously integrated. Then you have to update all your stakeholders. And of course, the developer experience is also then depending on which tech stack you use on your current application, is also something that suffered a bit and also added a lot of complexity. And at the end, the pattern lab, which we actually have spin up, was not fulfilling the designer's needs, because it was just probably a bit too much engineering focus. So we also struggled with delivering a really good designing the experience for our designers. And we had 15 consumers, which was already a lot, with also struggling with also components. So basically, what we have done, we probably have scaled up a system which was not ready to be scaled up. Also, one part of that, which was also probably at the end learning, which we have taken out of all that. In the beginning, we started to create a system out of a product feature team, which meant in Trivago you always have a freedom, around 20% of the work which you can dedicate to stuff you would like probably to work on. And so we started to create a system from within this product teams, but there was actually no owner on the system. So we said, okay, we need a centralized team, and then we split off a centralized team, which actually wanted to maintain the system. And then we went into struggle that we were so focused on the centralized system that we were not any more aware of what actually are the issues that actually the product teams are facing. And what we really have needed at that point is a combination of a centralized team, which owns the design system and pattern lab, and different contributors of all the different product teams that we have in Trivago. But again, this was this kind of chicken and egg problem. You don't have documentation, it's not bulletproof. It also makes it easier for people to onboard and to enable them to contribute to the system. And then what we also, Trivago is a very fast-growing company, and when we started with this design system, we were around 550 people, 250 people. When we actually got into scaling and maintaining it, Trivago was already around 100 people and has gone through different restructuring. So this is just one example, which is from the value chain, so how you build up a company to make sure that you always have areas of your companies that have basically end-to-end responsibility on something. So just an example how it will look like Trivago. We call it marketing pillar, which is responsible for user acquisition. Then hotel search is our core product. And then on the other side, you have the advertiser, where it actually is a connection to the advertiser. And you have something which is called global functions, where, for example, HR is sitting, because every of those pillars actually at the end is doing, for example, hiring. And my team was sitting here, and we were actually sitting in our core product, but actually we were serving the whole company, which led to some problems, because at the end, the acceptance rate of that design system was very, very high outside of our own department, which also was one of the reasons, because the hotel search is also just the most sophisticated and complex application. And we were actually here, and you can see actually where we are working, the acceptance rate of that system was not as we actually wanted. So this was not far less than ideal, and it also caused a lot of issues, because we were actually working in our department. We're building a design system which the department could not really efficiently use anymore. And at that point, in the end of 2017, we actually removed all the technical dependencies from our design system to our core application, the Trivago Hotel Search. Which was, of course, a bit sad, and it felt like, okay, we have failed. So this whole project was not a success. But at the end, the more retrospectives we made, and also looking now back after 2.5 years, it's always the question whether something was a success or probably it was a failure. And so it's now for me a bit up to share a bit of learnings that we identified over the years. So first of all, very clear is that we started, or we should have started smaller. And I think always you should aim high, but I think at that point we just went a bit too fast, and we should probably have focused a bit more on the foundation instead of directly going into scaling it up. And also, this was very clear, especially when we pitched it in 2015, we were probably a bit impacted by the overconfidence effect. So we were a bit too confident on things we were doing. This was also something very important learning. And at that point, I think we also struggled a bit with getting into a filter bubble, because now I'm also talking about something here in a remote conference, but sometimes you get a lot of input from the outside. For example, especially in the design system spectrum, we had a lot of input from companies which are probably 10 times larger than you. And probably at that point, we were not really looking at what is actually the best for us, but we were probably a bit too influenced what other companies are doing, and we're a bit in our filter bubble. And at that point, it was also probably something where we should have probably let other companies first do something and then adapt it. So there's always a differentiation between followership and leadership on the technical side. So leadership means you are actually the one who drives technology, while followership means, okay, in a very simplified way, you let other people try it out first, and then you adapt it, because probably other companies just have more resources or talents to try out certain things, and then you try to get the learnings from them instead of being the one who is then in kind of technological leadership here. And there were also a lot of, in retrospective on decision making and some thinking errors that we have clearly made. First is the availability bias. So especially in the beginning, when we spun off the design system, we only looked at this kind of feedbacks that we got from those teams where it was actually working very well, and we neglected it. So for example, if people told us on that product it's really working well, but not on the hotel search, then we thought, yeah, but it's probably the people working on hotel search are doing something wrong because our system works. The other teams told us. And the same is a bit also related to the confirmation bias, because at one point you start only believing or you see what you want to see. So what actually, again, it's a bit like, okay, for the other teams it works, so the design system works. For you it doesn't work, so it's not the design system, it's something else. And I think that's something which we then also realized probably a bit too late. It's the bias about sunk cost fallacy. So that means just because we have spent already 2 or 3 years on something, and then in our case it was going with the pattern lab, it doesn't mean that you need to follow it through. Just because you have spent 2 or 3 years on something doesn't mean it's worth to pursue in that way. At one point, if you see something isn't working, it doesn't matter on how much time you already have spent on it. And that leads me to the fact of actually what's left, what's all of that. We don't have our integration anymore, but was this whole project now a success or was it a failure? And if we really look on that in Trivago, we can still see that actually all the initial reasons we had to scale up our design system, which was to make everyone aware on how important consistency is for proper user experience, that is still existing. So even if we don't have a tech solution, we still have changed our mindset and have created awareness for this consistency topic. So we still have all our assets, at least on design side, properly sorted up, documented, and shareable. And as said, there is this common mindset that we now have inside Trivago, which was actually the success of this design system. And more than everything else, with that showing all that stuff, we actually raised the bar in terms of what are we willing to accept in terms of quality on the user interface of our product. And with that, I'm done. I hope I should be exactly in time. So my name is Christoph, leading currently the product department here at Trivago, which is focused on our core product. And thanks a lot for tuning in and listening to my presentation.
Thank you, Christoph. Now, once again, if you liked what Christoph had to say, let us know in the chat. Does anyone else have unicorns? I don't know. Just talk to us. Anyway, our next speaker, we're looking at meaningful experiences. And Ivana is now in her 4th year working on product designer at Microblink. She's mainly responsible for making complex technology accessible through user-driven design. Meaningful experiences. Let's welcome Ivana Cvetkovic.
My name is Ivana, and I'm the lead product designer here at Microblink. People often ask me what my job is about, and after I spend a good 10 minutes explaining to them, they go, "So, you're making all the apps look pretty." Yeah, there's a bit more to it. To borrow a quote from Steve Jobs, design is not just what it looks and feels like. Design is how it works. And when you're designing for AI-driven products and services, it's how it behaves too. Now, when I say AI-driven products and services, what I really mean is products you use every day. Slack, Uber, Netflix, Spotify, all of them are sprinkling a little bit of AI on top of their UI. Microblink is no exception either. Our flagship product, Blink ID, is a part of some 500 apps ranking from airline operators to financial service providers. Today, I'll share what I've learned on that journey and how it's changed my role as a product designer for good. But first, what is AI? Or even better, let's talk about what AI isn't. AI isn't and likely won't be for some time a conscious being. You can't actually hold a conversation with Alexa beyond some simple instructions she's been trained to respond to. So we are still far away from that general AI our pop culture loves to rave about. If you remember the Samanthas from the movie Her or the whole 9000s from the Space Odyssey. So if we take away those science fictional expectations, what we are left with is something called narrow AI. And narrow AI can do amazing things in its own domain. It can even do some tasks better than we do, such as filter spam mail, stop a moving car, and in our case, read personal information from ID documents. So you are now watching Blink ID in action. You can see that it actually understands a few things much like a real person does, or even better. You can see that it knows exactly where the name, the address, the date of birth are on each type of document. And it knows exactly what kind of document you are holding, be it a Belgian passport or Malaysian ID card. Blink ID is able to understand all of the messy stuff us humans have created. And that is AI that is helping it pierce through the confusion. Of course, there is a very systematic approach behind this borderline intelligence. The algorithms behind Blink ID have been purpose-trained on vast amounts of very specific data, so that the actual software can find the pattern it needs to arrive at a conclusion of what it's seeing. This conclusion is what our users get on the results screen and eventually benefit from. AI tends to make some big promises, and people have developed huge expectations about them. With Siri, that's I'll answer anything. With Uber, that's I'll find you perfect ride. And with Blink ID, that's I'll scan all your info in less than a half a second. People tend to believe it because that is AI and nothing is impossible. In usability testing, for example, we've seen some people try to scan their ID documents in impossible conditions. They would shine the flashlight onto the document and cause a large amount of glare over some fields. So I asked them, if you can see those fields yourself, then how do you expect our technology to do it? And what they said was, just wait for it. It will scan eventually. But machines aren't perfect. That's why, unlike traditional product design, in designing for AI-driven products, we have to take a more inclusive, lateral approach. We are not designing a linear path to success anymore. We are designing for uncertainty and failure. AI will see a chihuahua when it's actually seeing a muffin. It will claim Obama is the king of United States. And it will order a dollhouse after being triggered by news story. So much of our work ahead as a product designers revolves around mitigating these fails, providing some sort of cushion for those weird or outright wrong results AI gives. And I think for us to do that, we need to have a strong grasp of what our products are good at, but also what they are lacking, so that we can bridge that gap with human judgment. We need our users to work alongside AI. We need them to stay in control. We don't need them to be spectators in the show. And in the context of Blink ID, we are extracting users' personal information for many reasons, and a single character mistake in one of the fields can really mess things up. Take one of our clients, The Line, for example. This is a huge transport company in Belgium that uses Blink ID to scan IDs of fare evaders. A fare inspector scans the offender's ID and sends a report with their personal information back to the office. Get one number wrong when scanning the address field, and you'll end up sending the fine to a person who's never even been on the bus. So even though our AI Power data extraction is extremely accurate. That doesn't mean it should be taken as the only source of truth. Sometimes it's important to involve a real human, in this case a fair inspector, to double check the information and to see if everything is correct. This is the key difference between traditional and AI-driven product design, because the scope of outcomes now is far wider. We need to surface this uncertainty inherent to machines. And we can do that by encouraging dialogue instead of letting our users hand their brains over to the machines. That confidence percentage Netflix gives you when suggesting a TV show based on your personal data is really there to tell you, hey, I'm pretty sure you want to watch this, but who knows, I might be completely wrong. You decide for yourself. So as a product designers, we need to voice this uncertainty. If developers are in charge of making AI act human, then we are in charge of appearing it human. It's very easy for businesses to jump headfirst into their product strategy and start with AI as a solution. Try to resist this temptation. Work your way back from the problem you're trying to solve and see whether AI is something that can help you deliver it better. This human-centered approach needs to be carried over to product designers too. We need to look at AI as a tool for driving meaningful experience and providing unique values to our users. It's about connecting the dots for the end users and stripping interface down to its bare bones. And with BlinkID, we asked ourselves, how can we leverage AI to do as much thinking for our users as possible? How do we make scanning your personal information easier than what it already is? As it turns out, there were quite a few ways. As you can see, first, we had a massive breakthrough when BlinkID learned to automatically recognize any ID document. What that meant for users is they didn't have to scroll all the way down to choose their ID from the list. The software already knew what document they were holding in their hands. Considering how many countries and document types are in the world, you can imagine how much time this has saved them. Next, as you can see also, thanks to our AI-driven document detection, we were able to get rid of the frame on the first screen. This meant a user scanning their ID could hold the document in a way that feels natural to them. We introduced Theoretical that does a great job of communicating what our AI does in the background. It pulsates when BlinkID is actively looking for a document. It spins when it's reading the information. And it displays a check mark upon a successful scan. We really wanted to go with a clean, clutter-free design that guides, but also informs user on every step of their way. We wanted to create a short, more meaningful user experience, and AI allowed us to do that. We talked a lot about machines getting it wrong and designing for that, but what should we do when users make a mistake? And how do we even find what mistakes they are likely to make? Well, in traditional product design, we would create prototypes, which is essentially, you all know, a set of images linked together to represent the final product. And then we would observe users interact with it and trying to accomplish their goal. But when you're designing for AI-driven products, you don't have this kind of luxury. There are simply too many directions AI can take, which is kind of its point, right? So the only solution you are left with is to test the real app, which means you have to develop the real app. And as a product designers, it is our job to get developers involved in this early stage and explain to them why this new methodology is needed. Because, for example, this is how we discovered certain points of friction in the scanning flow of our product, BlinkID. One of those was the distance between the document and the camera. People were often holding their IDs too close or too far away from the camera, and it was up to us to correct that behavior. Luckily, we already had a head start because our AI models could see this coming. So we designed feedback messages. that would tell the user how to hold the document and link them together with an event triggering them. And we thought that was it. What we found out pretty quickly, though, is that these images were disappearing way too fast, as you can see here. It turns out people can't read move closer in a half a millisecond. Who knew? So we did another round of usability testing to figure out the ideal time for these messages to stay on the screen. And we learned that we need to slow them down so the people would have time to read and understand what they're supposed to do. And that's what it's all about. Taming AI in a service of a user. Because you can have the fastest running AI models in the world, but if it's not getting your users across the finish line, then what's the point? And if you live today with one takeaway, let it be this. Don't let this fascinating new technology make you lose sight of the fact that you are designing for real people. Keep them in control, get them involved, and design for their success as well as failure. And of course, don't forget to keep those screens looking pretty. Thank you for listening to me. I'll be joining you for any questions you may have in a moment.
Thank you, Ivana. We have a full lineup of speakers for you today. We have just two more left, so just stay with us, take some notes, and get ready for our next speaker, who's a senior developer advocate, software engineer, and program manager, as well as being a teacher. They contribute to a lot of open source projects and run some major communities across Africa and particularly within Nigeria. They're an international speaker, and when they're not internationally speaking, they enjoy reading a few books, going to see some movies, and catching up with friends and family. I mean, who doesn't love doing that, right? Let's welcome Shodipo Ayomide.
Hi everyone. Hello. Yeah, I'm so excited to be at this conference. Thanks so much for the organizers for having me on board. This is the SHIT conference Croatia 2020. Thanks for attending. Trust me, gonna love this session, and I love this session also. So I'm gonna be speaking about design from the realm of open source. So starting with a quote by a friend, it says, "Open source is a new source." So like source and source, that's the conjunction. Let's get right into it. I do open source, so I contribute to projects over GitHub, and I also have a couple of open source projects on GitHub. So open source. So next, I'm GitHub star. So I'm a star at GitHub. So this is a program that is meant to give more people who are software engineers and community managers visibility in the global community ecosystem. So yeah, as the person who introduced me said, I'm a senior developer advocate. I'm developer programs manager, and these are just a few communities I run. So there's like Africa Hacks, Steps in Lagos from Facebook, React JS Lagos, and Open Source Community Africa. Let's get cooking. So yeah, designers don't get less creative. The more you produce design assets, the more creative you get over time. So experience is what makes a designer better at what the designer does usually. So experience as a developer, when you continually produce projects, side projects, and as a designer, you continue producing side projects, the more better you get in solving problems, in fixing anything, the more better you get. Basically, experience is what makes you a better designer or anything at all. So, what exactly is the problem with designers in open source? What exactly is the problem in this ecosystem? And that's what I'm going to show us in the next slide. So starting out with collaborating as a design as an open source designer, as open source as a designer can be a bit intimidating and confusing based on the level of features you see already prepared with little or no documentation. Documentation should always be made for designers. There should be that portion of the README file as a developer with notice file where there should be that section for designers so they can understand how exactly they can start contributing to these open source projects. If this is not there, they get confused, and we need to also support more developers, more designers, and more people across talents. And for designers, I'm talking about this section in the README file that has to do with documentation for designers, which is going to ease the documentation, the ease of onboarding designers into a particular open source project. So another problem here is the ideology of designs are not needed in open source, just make it work. I've heard a couple of people say this, and they say, we do not like design as an ideology, just make it work. I don't care about how it looks. All I care about is, does it work? I don't care about how fast is it, but what I care is that does it work? So this is a problem that we need to fix, and we need to change in the global community, and we need to get more designers on board. And design is not an ideology, it is a profession that I believe every project and every company should be involved in. So let's talk a bit about the solution. So the first solution I'm going to talk about is resources. So we need resources tailored towards how to contribute to open source as a designer, number one. So thanks to organizations like the Open Source Design, Open Source Initiative, and other design related organizations trying to create design related content for the global community and designers, so they can find that easy transition in becoming a designer and moving into contribute to open source as a designer. So if you need documentation on how to become better, you can watch this talk to the end, and also visit Open Source Design or Open Source Initiative. Now let's move on. So next is the solution. On the solution here, next is the conferences. So we need conferences tailored towards open source for designers on a large scale, just like exactly what is happening right now. We need more conferences like this that would take design seriously, design and open source very seriously. That will help basically workshops that will just say, okay, designers and open source, how exactly will you you all contribute open source. This is a workshop. That would be exciting to have, and someone should just put this out there and let's make this work. So the next is tools. So developers and companies need to create more tools to help aid designers contribute open source effectively. So we have developers, we have companies creating multiple tools over the internet to enable them work faster, to enable developers work faster. But now is the time to really create those tools for developers that will help developers work faster. We need this to work, and we need these tools. We need developers to come together. We need companies to come together to create tools to help designers work faster. This is really important and help them contribute to open source easier. So next is designers need to understand how to communicate with developers, and developers need to understand how to communicate with designers. This is a two-way street, not a one-way street. So designers need to understand developers, and developers need to understand designers. So you don't have to know how to code. Many people always, I've heard it many times over Twitter, over many places about contribute open source. You have to know, as a designer, you have to know how to write CSS. You know now. So I'm disclosing that right now. You don't need to have. You don't need to know how to write CSS. You don't have to. It's not mandatory. It's a plus. If you can, great. If you can't, totally fine. But what's most important is the ability to communicate. That's very important. So next, so getting started with open source software OSS as a designer. So my definition of open source is basically open source in a nutshell is a free software built by the community for the community, and improvements shared across different technical talents in a community. So I'm going to take that again. So open source in a nutshell is a free software built by the community for the community with improvements shared across different technical talents. So yeah, this is basically what open source is to me, and this is what I see open source as. And I'm excited to be able to get open source out there and get more designers and developers to contribute open source. It's very exciting that I get to do this, and yeah. So the web has been open source since Chrome released a feature called the web page source and the inspect element. So by automatically, when you click on view page source, you get to see the HTML part of the website, and you get to see the code part of that part. If you for the elements part, you can get to see the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. So if you understand how code works as a designer, basically CSS in code, not JavaScript, not just basically CSS, you can pinpoint where exactly the problem is coming from, and you can make list changes yourself. So how can a designer begin contributing to open source? Let's talk more about this in the next slide. So the best place and the first place to start out as a designer is the GitHub Issues tab. Whether a developer, a designer, whatever role you're running, the best place to start when it has to do with open source and contribution is the Issues tab. Yeah, next slide. So after going there, you see a project. What do you do next? You evaluate the chosen project's workflow, user experience, color combination, and every single component you believe exists that you can change. You evaluate all of this, make documentations, write things down there, you make a proposal. Never start a feature without consulting one of the project authors. It's if it's a valid ad, and basically how it can be improved to get their opinions on this side of the project you want to work on or improve as a designer. Coming up with alternative design patterns, but raising an issue in relation to why and how in timeline. So basically, you can come up with ideas on how a certain product and a certain open source project can be improved. But it's really important that you create issues before you go ahead and create a pull request. The right manner to contribute maintainers, you don't go ahead and just create a pull request. Really conversing with the project maintainers and authors if it's a valid addition and if you can continue work on this. So next is prototype your design properly if you are contributing to open source project to an open source project where they care less about design, so as to convince them of how the feature should work and how it currently works. So you have two previews: one, how the project currently works; number two, how the project should work. So you're gonna prototype how exactly it should work. You're gonna design, you're gonna prototype, you're gonna share the link so they can, thanks to Adobe XD for creating that feature of the share link. So you can prototype on your Adobe XD and share a link, and they can see the prototype of how it works. So they can see basically how the user experience is being improved if they adapt to your open source contribution. Then they say, okay, amazing, let's move forward to this contribution of design. So yeah, so this part, so basically these are just some crappy things some engineers say about design that I would love to talk about. And yeah, so yeah, let's talk about this. It's really important. So many people say, I've heard this over time that say design is an ideology and not a professional profession. This is wrong. So design is a department. Design is a profession that people like a whole bunch of people are in, and it's something professional and shouldn't be called an ideology because it's not. And yeah, so this is really important, and this should never be said in any community. So next is, if the end product is quality software, why can't designers code? So I've heard this also a couple of times, and this is really wrong. Also, designers, I've said this before, so designers do not have to know how to code. As long as you can communicate with the developer and the developer can communicate with you, there will be ease in transmission of ideas and improvements easily. Communication is what is most important, and that's what will help you become a better designer. You can communicate with people across talents, across technical skills, but you don't need to know how to write code. You just know how to communicate. That part is really important, and that's one of the skills that makes you a senior product designer. So design is one of the most important and significant departments while being a startup product or working on open source projects. This is really important. Open source projects, startup, the design department should be present in projects or startups. So next, yes, I said before, the web inspector and the VP source grants you access to live debugging, the CSS, the JavaScript, or the HTML. So next is the version control, like design history, something like Gits. So this is an idea I have that I'm working on, where you know how for designers who have used Adobe XD, you know that once you make any single change in Adobe Photoshop, every single change you make are being logged in your design history, where even though you move the a square to the left hand side or to the right, it's being logged automatically into your design history. But think about it, how about if I have something for how I'll be able to push my designs from my local tool to GitHub as SVGs and still return them to my local tool and still return prototype as SVGs from GitHub. It's a lot of work, and I'm still working on this. Yeah, we'll be able to push designs between your local tool, Adobe XD, SketchUp, Figma to GitHub, and from GitHub directly to your design tool. This is something that I'm working on right now, and if whoever wants to collaborate with me with this on this, yeah, I'll definitely love collaboration to make this work for designers and make this tool work. So designing for multiple devices, as I said before, when you want to contribute to open source projects that they do not really so much believe in open source contributions to designer, you must go the extra mile to really convince them. Think about a company trying to raise revenue. You're trying to raise money from people, VCs all around. You're going to go the extra mile to make your pitch deck as advanced as possible, so everyone can really really understand the message you're trying to pass on. That's part really important. So you need to go the extra mile by creating multiple devices, responsiveness, prototyping, so they can be convinced and you can finally contribute. Sorry. So yes, next is start writing documentation. We need to do this part. So start writing documentation for other designers to see and follow along. It's a trend someone has to start. Someone didn't start because they believe someone else would. And at the end, no one ends up starting until probably a couple of years later, and probably also an eternity later. Then, yeah, someone has writes documentation for designers. It's something that we need to do, and I think we need to really focus on this part of contributions. So I'm getting to the last part of my talk. So let's talk about a few tools that we needed as designers. I'm just going to run through this. Yeah. So first things first, for design tools, we have Figma, Adobe XD, and we have SketchUp. There are other design tools, but these are the top three I decided to mention. We have for prototyping, we have Invention Studio, Adobe XD, Camera Studio, Sketch, Webflow, Framer, Zeppelin, FlowMap. For design, for discussion and collaboration, we have Zeppelin, Slack, Figma, InVision. So resources were not openly distributed as it is today. We have people writing articles, creating video content, running workshops, running conferences, talks, writing research articles, and a whole bunch of other contents that we're putting out there as community members. So today is the best time to start contributing to open source as a designer, and I believe you should start now by going to github.com. So these are some resources and some organizations with a couple of open source projects you can take a look at. There are a whole bunch of them over GitHub, but these are just a few. And you want to learn more about open source, opensource.org, Open Source Design, Open Source Community Africa, and Force. Then Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, open source too. Apple has open source project. Many companies, PHP is open source, JavaScript is open source. a whole bunch of products out there that we use are open source. You can contribute to them as a designer. So yes, thank you very much. I'm gonna be in the Q&A session if you have any questions for me, and you can follow me on Twitter or GitHub at developer.ao. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for the call to action you also had on your presentation, and telling people to go on GitHub, but also the different resources you've listed after for people to start their open source journey. Maybe one question that I have for you, to get started.
Yeah.
If I was to ask you, do you think that open source software is too complicated for designer? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so for open source software complications and designers, so it's not complicated because I believe I mentioned open source design, open source initiative. These organizations coming together to create content, written content, video content, put together conferences that they can help more designers contribute open source. We have these organizations, so basically putting out content. And one thing that I believe we need to do to fix this problem about complication of contribute open source and designers is documentation. I believe I mentioned the part where we should always have the section in our documentation on GitHub for designers, specifically for designers, where they can just write something. Basically, as a designer, you want to contribute open source. What do I do? How do I start? You write that small content in the documentation so designers can see and follow along. And yeah, I think once we can create more content and have more conferences like what Ship's conference is doing right now, I believe it would be less complicated. Yeah, we need more content out there.
So no, thanks for that, and I think that makes sense actually. And for everyone here on YouTube, you obviously have the capacity of asking us a question, and I will take it for Shodipo. As a follow up on that one, so let's assume I'm a designer. I understand that open source is of value. So how do I start contributing? So where do I start going to find the project, but also learn from the mistakes that other people have done in order for me to improve my skill and be able to essentially become a more effective designer using open source?
Okay, so great question. Thanks, Janice. So now the right map to contribute open source is you look for a project you love. Number one, you must love and be excited about the project. That part is very important. You must love and you must be excited about the project. It's very important so you don't lose focus, because this is not something you are being paid to do. It's something that is open source, it's something you are volunteering for in your free time. So you must love the project so you don't lose passion and stop contributing. So the first step is to go to a website called github.com, then find a project you love, go to the issues tab, look for an issue that has to be designed that you can fix. Some open source projects have the tag label called design. So those are design contributions. You can also, if it's a product you love, when you look at their website, look at their product, you see something that you think you can change, go to their issues tab. If the issue is not opened already, create a new issue. Then tag the maintainer saying, hey, I saw this on your website, send screenshots saying, I believe this can be improved. And they're going to ask you, how can this be improved? What's your take? What's your comment? Then at that point, you can make a prototype. You make a design, prototype it, share a link, so they can be able to use the application and see how the user experience can be better according to your suggestion. Then once they say, this is amazing, then go ahead and making improvements to your prototype so you can get a designer to implement your design. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And obviously, because we only have 5 minutes, and as a closing question, and I just want one sentence from you. If someone could have taught you something when you were, at school, just before starting your career, what is the biggest piece of advice you would want to have known, as a 20-year-old in a single sentence? And then that will be the end of today's Q&A with you.
Okay, thanks for the question. So I would say I would do a lot of research. I would do a lot of research. I would use Google a lot. I would use YouTube a lot, and I will try my best to really fix every problem I have and spend every single day learning and becoming the best designer and best developer I can be of myself, and not just becoming a designer, but becoming someone who will be able to contribute to the community and impacts people all over the globe. Because trust me, as a designer, you can do in your local community, but if you really want to go, like you have a vision, you want to get to more people, I would say go for it. Join a huge community, submit call for papers about design, and speak at events, write articles, do all of these things.
Okay.
And yeah, that's what I would say. That's what I would say.
Now, look, Shodipo, thanks a lot for taking part of the Shift conference. I think a really great
Yeah, I'm excited. Thanks so much for having me on my conference.
Glad everyone could benefit from this. So everyone, thanks for being here. Thanks for asking the question. And Shodipo, stay safe and thanks for the insight. Take care.
Same. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Shodipo. And with that, we have one final speaker to introduce to you for today's conference, who is a designer, strategist, tinkerer, and typographer who works with organizations across the world on how to set type better and improve performance on digital platforms. He's spoken at conferences and published across the world, and when he's not carrying on about improper quotation marks or slow font typing, he likes to walk the family dogs, who are Tristan and Tilly, around the Turner Reservoir and ride his bike. That sounds like a lovely life. Sounds like a lovely man. Let's introduce Jason Pamantal.
Hello. I apologize. I guess I've just been introduced, and I guess I'm getting started now. My name is Jason Palmentel, as I'm sure you might have heard, and I am going to be talking to you today about better typography on the web, and more to the point, really bringing more graphic design to the web. So using some techniques that we have in CSS and with a new thing about variable fonts, I want to show you some examples of how we might kind of push the way we think about and talk about graphic design and web design, and where those things can and maybe could do a better job of coexisting together. So I want to start with just a basic explanation of variable fonts. They're becoming more and more popular, so more and more people have heard of them, but just to kind of explain this a little bit more in context, OpenType is the font standard that allows us to install one font on both Windows and Mac and other systems. OpenType Variations is an evolution of that standard that leads to being able to put many things into a single file. So now, with older static fonts, you have to install a whole bunch of different files on your computer in order to have light and medium and bold and italic and all those different variations. That last word being the key. Having all of these contained in one file means that we're loading fewer assets. It's a more efficient data structure, and we're able to gain a broader design voice without having to load as many assets. Now, it's not quite as small as a single web font file, but we're often loading 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of them on a given website in order to get the range that we're looking for. And it's almost always smaller than that. And so let's take a look at what that means. The example here showing widths and weights of a single letter, but I'm going to enlist Tristan and Tilly, our dogs, to kind of show you a little bit more graphically what we mean by having all of these axes of variation contained in that single file. So with some simple CSS, we might be able to vary a width axis. Perhaps a more popular one might be weight. There are some typefaces that even have an axis for X height. And of course, we have slant. Now, all of these, with the exception of the X height, are what they call registered, or some of these core axes of variation that are the much more common ones that are tied into pre-existing CSS. So font style with italic or oblique and some number of degrees, font weight, and font stretch are all pre-existing things. Now we can supply a number instead of just saying it's bold or normal. And that also brings with it another core registered axis around something called optical size. Now, that's actually something that originated hundreds of years ago in the world of metal type, where when they would physically cut a smaller size of type, they would make the lines a little bit more substantial, a little bit less thick and thin. And then on the larger size, they could showcase some of that detail. And this had to do with the quality of the metal type and the quality of the paper and the quality of the ink. Now, we have some similar things going on now today digitally, where it's the quality of the screen. How high density is the pixels in the display? Now, when type was first transitioned from metal to photo typesetting and then digital type starting in the 70s, what often happened was they would just simply scan one shape and then scale it. And so what you see here is an example of the same shape, just bigger or smaller. Now, with optical size, we can enable that and we can get something more like this. Notice especially that first line of type, the detail is much finer, but there's really no change down below. So I'm going to back up again and then go forward. So you can see there's some subtle differences in spacing, the thick and thin of the strokes of those letters, where it really showcases some beautiful fine details as you look at the top lines of text. Now, font optical sizing can be just set to auto or none. That's a new property that we have in CSS that's supported in all the shipping browsers right now. And font variation settings being the lower level way of accessing these things. And for optical size, if you want to set a specific value, then you would want to use this method. However, font variation settings trumps other aspects of CSS, and where font weight and font stretch are universally supported in every browser that supports variable fonts, that also preserves a little bit better ability to fall back should the variable font not load. So wherever possible, we want to use the real CSS, the proper stuff, and then with a custom axis, which is like X height, the typeface designer can expose a different axis, give us a 4-letter sort of keyword and a value range. Now, I do want to mention that you probably have noticed that this is being presented in Firefox. This is all real CSS and real web fonts. So none of this is an image of text. It's all real text that we're seeing on the screen. So, so we've looked at a few different kinds of axes. We're looking at some different things kind of in action. Now I want to start talking about the design side of this. And what can we do if when we load this single axis, single font file, we can actually get 1,000 different widths or weights instead of just 1 or 2 or 3. We can get everything in between. That opens up a lot of opportunity. And what you see here is a simple combination of a CSS shape with widths on that shape set to ems, so it's relative to the size of the type that it's wrapping, and then a float. So 2 simple techniques combined with this variable text allows us to create a much more interesting interplay between these headings and text, and that's what good graphic design is all about. By introducing tension, we create a more memorable experience, something that is a little bit more alluring. It holds our attention a little bit more. And we don't see that much on the web because that's previously been kind of hard to do. But CSS shapes are really well supported. We've got content management systems that are really extensible in what kind of controls we can put in there. So building to fine tune the axis of variation that we might have for a headline, I've done that. It's pretty easy to do. You can do it really in any CMS where you can have it generate a little snippet of a style sheet that applies just to that page. So I thought that I would kind of explain this and showcase it a little bit through the process of 4 covers and 4 stories. And so that's really going to be taking an evolution of what might be the first page of our blog. So it might look a little bit like this. And this exact same HTML, we're going to look at it 4 different ways. And then we're going to take one of these stories and we're going to do the same thing. So a little bit of hierarchy here, biggest headline up top and a little bit more of a teaser with the thumbnail photo, and then down below the next 3 most important stories, and then 3 more after that that don't have the teaser text. There's at least a nod towards a little bit of visual hierarchy. So you can imagine this is not so far apart from a typical blog homepage, but why not build a little bit more control in, and with that same HTML, do a play on something like this. So this is a poster that was created by this artist to advertise his own work in the 50s. And the interplay in those letter forms is really interesting. It's really playing with weight and overlap in kind of some interesting ways. And we can do that. So by increasing the weight and decreasing the letter spacing, I've created and playing around a little bit with the text shadow. We have something arranged our layout a little bit. We're using a little bit of grid, we're using a little bit of flexbox, normal stuff, and then we're layering that on top of the image. And by introducing a little bit of opacity through using RGBA, we can then create more layering. So we've got layering of the photo and the letter forms themselves and the shadows, all adding up to maybe a little bit more compelling, impactful experience for that first story. And looking at another way that we might do it, if we take their cue from another magazine cover, they're really big on scale and weight. So they've got this, really big headlines where they've kind of gone with a lighter weight, but much like all caps maybe, or they've a different kind of treatment. And they've done a lot to make sure that the text is being overlaid in areas where it's light on dark or dark on light, where it really stands out. Well, on the web, we don't always have that same kind of control, but we do have things that, like Sarah Swedon will talk about, like SVG filters. So instead of doing something like that, we might add a couple of these filters as something we could enable and introduce a color overlay on a photo and sort of desaturate it and add the color overlay to help increase contrast. Now we've changed the weight and the width of the text to really exaggerate the scale, change the layout a little bit, and we could have one or more different color overlays that we could choose in our publishing process to change the amount of contrast and maintain good accessibility with this content. And then finally, there's one more that I wanted to show because I had found this magazine where they use this layout pretty regularly. It's called Eloquence Magazine, and they have this style where they have this cutout, this knockout for the photo with the text overlay, and that got me thinking about CSS blend modes and thinking about ways we could introduce text and image interplaying in a way that will ensure contrast, but create a more interesting visual effect. So this is the first place where I've introduced one additional typeface. Everything else has been one font file being loaded. Now I've introduced a second for the main headline here, and then because we want that really heavy, almost surface-like characteristic of that font, increase the weight, make it really heavy, and then use a CSS blend mode in order to create the contrast between the text and what's underneath it. It's all, it's all still an image and editable text. So this could come directly out of a CMS without any issue. And again, we've shown 4 very different layouts, very different graphic styles without having to change one line of the underlying HTML. So it's very possible for us to do these kinds of things. It just takes a little bit of sort of self-awareness and a decision to not just stop with one layout. Because that's another thing that a lot of people don't realize. If you look at a great magazine design, like Vogue or Vanity Fair, or I apologize for not knowing about any good Croatian magazines, but look at anything that has some thought being given to it. Most of them have more than one article layout. So you could imagine that instead of only having one template for that content type of article, maybe you have a choice of choosing more than one. So we've got a fairly typical layout with the thumbnail and main headline, subhead, and text. And instead of something like that, maybe you could choose an alternative that scales and crops the photo, changes the weight of the headline, layers it on top, and maybe you add something to increase the contrast if you need to based on the kinds of imagery you're using. The subhead is floated off to the left with a 50% width. So all of these things will then collapse down to a single column on a small screen. But again, we haven't changed a line of the underlying CSS, or HTML rather. It's just a CSS change. But this is maybe a little bit more interesting, but not any great departure. Maybe we want to do something that plays a little bit more with the CSS shape. Now, I helped a firm put this into practice on their own blog, and what we did, it's a static site generator. When they want to introduce a layout like this, all they have to do is add one class in the front matter, and then at the bottom of the page, edit one line of CSS that's embedded in the page. And all they're doing is editing the shape that's around here. And so, I'll live dangerously. I'll come back to that. If you use Firefox DevTools, you can actually highlight that shape and move it and play around with that shape. You can just get points on each corner, and then you can copy those changes and bring them back in. So down below, we've used pseudo selectors to select the first line of text and use the open type feature for small caps. So we get true small cap lettering in the first line of the paragraph, no matter how wide it is. And it's a first of type style for that first paragraph overall. So it's really common in publication design to style the first paragraph a little bit differently. It's usually called a lead. And that lead paragraph needs to have a little bit more emphasis. So maybe it gets a little wider, maybe treat it a little bit differently. In this case, it's bigger, it's lighter weight, it's a little bit more spaced out. And then finally, we could push that even further and go to something like this. Now, writing modes is something that Jen Simmons has spoken about a lot in the last couple of years in her talks about how do we bring better graphic design to the web. And I would contend that even if it scrolls off the screen, it's not going to take that long for someone to figure out what that title is. And it's not that uncommon a design solution when you see it in print. It takes a moment to tilt your head, but you're going to remember that a little bit more. And so again, still same HTML. We've added another SVG filter to get a different colorization on that same photo. We've styled that lead paragraph again, just a little bit differently, but we've created something that with the same underlying markup, with only a few lines changing, it might be 30 or 40 lines of CSS to create these different layouts, and that's it. And so those things could easily be built into our system. And now that we've got these design systems and CMS setups, or even static site publishing, building these switches and levers in here so that on a per post basis, we could introduce a little bit more variability to create a more interesting and varied layout from article to article would go a long way to making the web feel a little bit more intentional and not just more of the same. And so I think I'm probably running pretty close to time, I think, for uh, what I've got. I really hope that this has been useful for you. I want to make sure that you have a chance to grab that link down at the bottom. If you look me up unnoticed and find this talk there, all these slides are embedded on that page, and there's a ton of additional resources. So I write a monthly newsletter. Well, used to be weekly. Now it's a little less often on web typography. All those tips are archived on my site at rwt.io. I created a variablefonts.io site for the Google Fonts platform to teach you about the basics of implementing variable fonts. And there's a whole host more links there for things that you can find to play around with yourself, and places to find variable fonts. So with that, I'd love to answer any questions if you've got them, and happy to go back in these slides and actually inspect stuff and demo things if you want to see it.
So first of all, Jason, thank you very much for this outstanding presentation. Like I said, I'm not a technical person myself, but on the other side, I think what you've done is kind of that great mix between technicality and the practicalities of actually doing this. And the second one, if Nick was there, he would actually also see I'm typically the person that puts my dogs on keynotes. So I'm fully in love with what you've been doing. But maybe, you know, just to beyond that whole personal fanboy moment here, you clearly have a very good visual graphic eye and also a very strong technical background, right? To be able to do those dynamic typographies. How did you learn, and which one did you learn first? Did you have a background first on the graphic side, or did you have a background first on the technical side?
Well, they actually originated close to the same time. I studied graphic design back in the sort of early mid 90s, and my job on campus was to make the school's first website. And so I've been working on the web since about 1994, and I've seen sort of every evolution since then, where we had no control over color or background or text, on up through the introduction of the font element and attributes, and in HTML, and then eventually CSS and Cipher and QFont and all these other ways to pretend to get better fonts and typography. But as CSS evolved, I ended up getting a beta invite to Typekit in 2009, and that really reinvented web design for me. Between that and responsive design, those things both happened like within about a year, and that totally changed the way I started thinking about it. And that was right about the time I started writing and speaking about web fonts, and so pretty quickly I ended up starting to build up a lot of research about how to implement web fonts well, because that technically was still a real barrier. The performance was a big problem, or a challenge anyway, to get that balance right. And so I ended up writing a book for O'Reilly that came out in 2014 about what I referred to as responsive typography, and that was a combination of performance, making sure things load well, making sure things still work well when they don't load, and then scaling the typography based on screen size. And so it's been a kind of a self-reinforcing kind of thing. Like I love design, I love typography, but we couldn't do that on the web for a really long time. But what I'm finding now increasingly is that we actually can do even ever more sophisticated typography, and variable fonts play a big part in that, in enabling us to subtly change the typography in light and dark mode, to introduce the ability for people to actually set the typography for themselves. So this project I've been doing in my newsletter is typesetting Moby Dick, the book. And so if you go to mobydick.wales, W-A-L-E-S, then you can see the status of that project. And there's all kinds of user settings to go with the light and the dark mode, to change the size, the spacing, the line height. There's a whole bunch of things that you as the reader can do to tailor it to your own preference. And I think that's where it's just a fascinating mix of both the design and the technical to create something that is the best experience for the person who's looking at it at the time.
No, I think that makes perfect sense, and I think the fact that you've been doing it for a while, first in the book format and now making it available to everyone, is fantastic. Maybe two more questions as we start slowly running out of time. The first one is, comparatively to a custom web post, right, as opposed to something more dynamic, how much harder do you think it is? So, is it a 10% harder, 20% harder?
Well, let me give you two ways to think about that. Because a variable font is only a couple lines of difference in the @font face rule, potentially there's no difference in how you use it in your CSS. So if the font weight, if 400 maps to normal and 700 maps to bold, you could just drop that font in there and don't do anything else. So I worked with an agency on a big sports broadcasting site here in the US, their whole streaming platform, and we replaced the 8 different static fonts with 2 variable ones in an afternoon. So it took us about 3 or 4 hours, and then maybe a little bit of like debugging and QA, to save over 300K in the font load per page, without having to go back and rewrite any of the core styles. So it doesn't have to be a lot of extra work. The opportunity is once you've put them in place, now we can do a lot more, where say on a small screen, bold doesn't have to be 700. Maybe it'd be better if it was 600. Where because as the letter forms get smaller, they get more closed up if you're using that same weight. So you want emphasis, but you want clarity. So on small screens, you could use media queries, you could use viewport multipliers or whatever to change the weight of what bold means based on the size of the text and the size of the screen. So it could be a lot more time, but it doesn't have to be. It just depends on how much more you want to allow the designer to do during the publishing process. And I think that's just where it starts to get exciting.
No, perfect. And perhaps as a very last question on my side, I typically like rule of thumbs, right? To things that you remember always. And so what is that one tip that you would typically say to people to really differentiate your website from the masses using typography? I mean, I've learned once that you should never use type fonts. The next type font, the closest type font you should use after is twice the size as the other one, so you can put some contrast. You should never go in between. You should go bold all the way to thin. But is there another rule of thumb that you have seen that creates 80% of the value in the least amount of time?
I think it's taking that same rule idea, but don't think about specific pixel values or weight values. Think about a proportion, because on a small screen, you might not want it to be twice as big. It might create a really awkward line wrap for your headings. On a phone, maybe 1 3/4 is okay. But on a big screen, maybe you want it 3 times the size. So it's about proportion. How do you create visual contrast in these different environments. And with responsive design, that's going to be different on a phone than it is on a, you know, a 27-inch iMac. So thinking in those two dimensions, contrast between a heading and body, and a link and a button and all of that, but then also contrast as the amount of stuff on the screen increases. So as the screen gets bigger, you tend to want to increase the contrast. So that's where, you know, your scale doesn't go this way, it kind of goes this way. And, you know, as the screen gets bigger, you want to create a greater contrast. And that's where the flexibility of variable fonts can come into play.
All right. Well, look, Jason, I think we're running out of time, but I do have to say, thanks a lot for sharing your passion. Thanks a lot for being so clear. Thanks a lot for showing the dogs over. I'm quite jealous. Hopefully next time I'll get to be on my side and I'll show Freudio around. But Jason, look, you've done an amazing job. Congratulations. Thanks for joining from the US. One of the benefits of having those online conferences as well. So real pleasure. And I hope that everyone thought it was insightful. And I believe all the links and details about Jason are shared now also on the YouTube link. So Jason, have a very nice day.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And I hope one of these days I get to raise a glass with you in person. You guys have been really great to work with. I appreciate it.
Real pleasure. Take care, Jason.
Bye.
Thank you, Jason. And with that, that brings us to the end of our 9th in this 12-part series where we bring together some of the brightest developers online for you, our incredible audience. If you've had a great time at Shift Remote, let us know. As ever, use the hashtag Shift Remote on all social media channels. Get in touch, give us a thumbs up there in the chat, give us a wave. But it wouldn't be a conference if we didn't have sponsors. And I want to say a huge thank you once again to the teams at Microsoft, Infobit, Raiffeisen Bank, Autodesk, Microblink, Barrage, Azure Idea, ICT, Japania, Venture, Pseudocode, 5, Ars Futura, Nanobit, Infinium, and Q. The teams also at Pluggy, at Code Anywhere, at Get by Bus, and Aspira. Without you, none of this would have been possible. So thank you so much. I also want to say a huge thank you to every one of you for joining us today. And hopefully we'll see you next time when we'll be back together once again. Go on our website, find out the details, and sign up there. But hopefully see you soon. Goodbye from me and goodbye from us here at Shift.